Somebody is lying. Nancy Grace said it herself, on air, without blinking. Two accounts of Nolan Wells' last conversation cannot both be true. They're mutually exclusive, and somebody in this story is lying. Why hasn't a single one of them taken a polygraph? Why did Nolan's phone end up in someone else's hands instead of his own? And why did his mother have to track it down herself? Why is his own grandfather still asking, 3 weeks later, where the video of that fight went? Why did a sheriff clear his friends of foul play in 24 hours? And why does the state's own autopsy stay sealed until a grand jury says otherwise? $125,000 is sitting on the table right now for anyone who can answer that. Nolan Wells' family says the blood is still crying out for an answer nobody in Mississippi has given them yet, and after 3 weeks, they are still waiting. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old. He had graduated the year before from Ocean Springs High School, where he played multiple sports, and by that 4th of July he was preparing to begin his second season as a wide receiver at Southwest Mississippi Community College. That much nobody disputes. Not the sheriff's office, not the family's attorney, not a single outlet that has covered this case since the first week of July. His own voice exists in the public record too, briefly, from National Signing Day back in 2025, when he called it a blessing to continue his football career there, a small, simple phrase that's worth holding on to precisely because almost everything else said about Nolan Wells across this entire account has been said about him by his mother, his coach, his best friend, rather than by him. The friend at the center of this account, the one you heard from across the first 3 parts of the series, is Warren Hudson, and that name matters, because for the first several days of national coverage he was simply a friend, unnamed, a voice in secondhand reporting. Hudson has since put his name to his account publicly, sitting down on camera with commentator Brandon Tatum, the same conversation you've been hearing pieces of. That alone is worth sitting with for a second, because it's a small, concrete detail that a lot of the loudest voices online skip past entirely. The friend group didn't stay anonymous. Whatever you think of how they've told their story, they told it under their own names on camera to a journalist who was not friendly territory for them by default. The first 3 parts of this series carried that interview across 3 separate conversations. The initial sit-down where Hudson was asked point-blank whether he killed Nolan, a second trip out to the actual dock and island to physically walk the ground the story happened on, and a third conversation pressing further into the timeline of that day itself. This 4th part is not a continuation of that same interview. It's what happens when everything said across those first 3 conversations gets pulled out of that single, sympathetic setting and run against 3 weeks of independent reporting from outlets with no connection to Hudson, to Tatum, or to each other. The friendship itself, before any of this happened, is worth understanding on its own terms, because so much of what gets argued online treats Nolan's friend group as an abstraction, 4 or 5 interchangeable young men, rather than as people with an actual shared history stretching back a decade. In his own telling, Hudson says he and Nolan came up together through elementary school, middle school, high school, and into their freshman year of college, that they talked on the phone constantly, and that in 8 years of friendship, he never once had an argument with him. He places the point where the two of them got genuinely close in 8th grade, that specific school year rather than any earlier or later point in their shared childhood, describing a running weekly ritual of going to a restaurant called Wallflies together after class, just the two of them and a couple of other friends, and he describes Nolan's father occasionally swinging by that same restaurant to check in on the two of them, a detail small enough and specific enough to one particular restaurant rather than a generic hangout that nobody would think to invent it if it weren't true. Hudson is also careful, unprompted, to note that he was never a regular presence at Nolan's own house, that the two of them mostly spent time at his place or at another friend's, and that when he saw coverage suggesting Nolan's mother didn't know who these boys were, he wanted that context understood rather than left to imply something colder than what he says the relationship actually was. None of that is independently verifiable in the way a GPS log or a recorded phone call is. It's a personal history, offered by one side of a friendship whose other side is no longer alive to confirm or dispute it. But it's also not contradicted anywhere in the outside reporting, and the family's own public statements have never disputed that Nolan spent real time with this group, going back years, socially and online both. What the family has disputed, forcefully and repeatedly, is not whether the friendship existed. It's whether that friendship, whatever its depth, is being used to paper over gaps in how thoroughly law enforcement has actually investigated what happened to their son. Those are two separate questions, and it's worth holding them separately rather than letting the strength of one answer the other. The texture of that friendship, in Hudson's own telling, is worth hearing at more length than a single summary sentence can carry, because it's the part of this entire case that plays the least like a legal defense and the most like an actual person grieving an actual friend. He describes Nolan as someone who lit up every room he walked in, who always had a smile on his face and always had something good to say. And he's specific about the negative space around that description too, saying he never once, in 8 years, saw Nolan get into an argument with anyone or say something unkind about another person at a time in life, high school, and the years just after, when nearly everyone in a friend group ends up on the wrong side of some falling out or another. He describes a friend group that leaned on humor constantly, joking, laughing, nobody taking much of anything too seriously, and says that if he or anyone else in that circle needed to get something off their chest, Nolan was one of the people they'd go to, someone who showed up the same way for everyone, not selectively. He's also candid, almost defensively so, about the boundaries of a relationship, that he was never really a fixture at Nolan's own house the way Nolan was at his, that he'd met Nolan's father but wasn't around Nolan's parents often, a detail he brings up specifically because he'd seen coverage implying the family didn't know who these friends even were, and he wanted it understood that the distance between families didn't reflect distance between the boys themselves. Whatever you make of everything else in dispute in this case, that specific, granular, unglamorous kind of description, the 8 years of never arguing, the weekly restaurant ritual, the dad who used to swing by and check in, reads far more like the ordinary texture of a real adolescent friendship than like a script assembled after the fact to manage a public relations problem. That doesn't settle any of the harder questions in this case. It does mean the emotional core of Hudson's account, whatever else in it turns out to be contested, imprecise, or simply unprovable, is not obviously performance. That portrait doesn't rest on Hudson's word alone, either, which matters, because everything he says about Nolan comes from someone with an obvious personal stake in how this story gets told. His football coach at Southwest Mississippi Community College, Les George, has no similar stake, and he described almost exactly the same person in his own words to reporters. To get the news that he's no longer with us is something that's hard to put into words. You know, it's heartbreaking. George described Nolan as someone who was going to do things the right way, whether it was in the classroom, if it was getting to a meeting on time, or doing everything he was supposed to in workouts or practice, and recalled a smaller, specific memory that reads as more convincing than any general tribute could, that Nolan didn't get playing time in a particular game, but was still genuinely thrilled watching his teammates win. Celebrating a victory he had no personal stake in earning. His teammates have kept his chair empty in the receiver's meeting room since his death, an unprompted gesture with no audience beyond themselves. His high school itself said much the same thing in more institutional language. Ocean Springs head football coach Jake Bramlett called him the kind of son, teammate, friend, and student that every coach hopes to have in a program, and Principal Dr. Jacob Dykes described him as a remarkable student, teammate, and brother who left a lasting impression on his teachers, coaches, teammates, and community. None of that comes from anyone with a reason to manage the story in one direction or another, and all of it lines up with what his childhood best friend independently described: months and states away from a football program that had known Nolan for barely a year. Here's where the first twist in this story lives, and it's not a twist anybody invented. It's a twist built entirely out of the order you're allowed to learn things in. If you came to this case through headlines alone, the mental picture you were probably handed was small and sharp: a secluded island, a handful of white teenagers, one black teenager, and then he's gone. That image does a lot of work, and it's the image that launched 1,000 furious comment sections. Except Horn Island on the 4th of July is not secluded. It is not small. Independent GPS data pulled from the boat's own onboard system and separately reported surveillance footage from the dock that morning both point in the same direction as what Hudson has said from his very first interview. This wasn't 4 kids on an empty sandbar. The boat left a private dock at 9:56 in the morning and reached Horn Island by 11:14, according to the GPS records later obtained by reporters, numbers that run a little later than the 10, 10:30 window Hudson gives in his interview, a gap of roughly 45 minutes to an hour that nobody has fully explained, and small enough that it reads more like the normal fuzziness of memory 11 days after a trauma than like a deliberate misstatement, but a gap worth naming rather than smoothing over. It's worth pausing on why a gap like that shouldn't automatically read as suspicious, because a huge amount of the online scrutiny this case has generated treats any inconsistency, no matter how small, as proof of a cover-up, and that instinct misunderstands how memory actually works under stress. People who have lived through a chaotic, alcohol-involved, hours-long day on the water, followed within hours by a friend going missing and, 2 days later, turning up dead, are not reliable narrators of exact clock times from that day, and that isn't a character flaw. It's simply how human memory functions when trauma arrives on top of an ordinary event before the brain has had any chance to flag that event as one worth recording precisely. Investigators, and honestly journalists too, generally learn to expect this. The broad sequence of events, who did what in roughly what order, tends to hold up far better under stress than the specific minute-by-minute clock does. That's exactly the pattern here. Hudson's sequence: dock, island, fight, boat trouble, departure, Fort Bayou, home, pool party, calls, is identical in shape to what GPS records and audio recordings independently confirm. The only slippage is in the exact minutes, a 45-minute gap on a morning arrival time that nobody was checking a watch for in the first place. That's not evidence of dishonesty. It's evidence of an ordinary human being asked to reconstruct a day, 11 days later, that started as fun and ended as the worst day of his life. Before the boats even left the dock, according to Hudson's account, the morning itself had its own small, ordinary shape to it, the kind of shape that only matters now because everything that came after it turned it into evidence. He described staying the night before at a friend's house with Nolan, waking up, going to McDonald's without him, coming back to find a boat already hitched to his truck, driving from the Fort Bayou boat launch to a friend's grandparents' house, which is where the wider group actually converged that morning. That convergence point is where the numbers start to matter, because it's the exact place where the four boys and Nolan framing falls apart under its own weight. By Hudson's account, somewhere between 20 and 30 people were splitting across 3 separate boats that day, Nolan riding out on a 22-foot Triton owned by a friend named Wyatt Pyron, with roughly 8 or 9 people aboard, an 18-foot Palm Beach carrying 4 young men, and a 24-foot Tidewater belonging to a friend Hudson calls Bart, whose full name has since been reported as Bart Edmiston Jr., carrying the largest group, somewhere between 10 and 16 people, including a number of college friends and their girlfriends. Hudson says he specifically wanted to bring down for the holiday. Sheriff Ledbetter's own office has since put a specific, named roster on the record for exactly who left the island together around 3 o'clock that afternoon. Wyatt Pyron, Warren Hudson, Eli Jack Spatalo, Eric Alcantara, and Morgan Seymour. That's not a vague, the friend group any longer. It's 5 named people the sheriff's office itself has identified as present for the decision to leave without Nolan, and every one of them has, to varying degrees, been named publicly, questioned by investigators, or both. Hudson himself rode out on the Tidewater, not the boat Nolan was on, a detail that matters later because it means his own eyewitness account of anything that happened directly around Nolan that day is, by his own description, secondhand from the water rather than something he watched from 6 feet away the entire afternoon. He describes the ride out as calm, 3 or 4 knots of wind, clear water, music blasting the way it does on every 4th of July trip he's ever taken. Nothing about the crossing itself distinguishing that day from any other holiday run out to the island, and describes the ride back that evening as rougher, choppier water that still never came close to overwhelming any of the 3 boats making the trip. Horn Island itself, in Hudson's own description, runs roughly 10 to 12 miles end to end, long enough that even standing on it, he says, you can't see where it stops, a detail that reinforces the same point the crowd numbers already make. This was never the small, contained stretch of beach a secluded island narrative requires. It's an unremarkable morning, told in granular enough detail that it reads like memory rather than performance, and it's the exact kind of texture that never survives being compressed into a headline. What both the friend group and the outside data agree on is the scale of what greeted them once they got there. Reporting since has repeatedly described boats lined up for miles along the island's edge, a 4th of July crowd numbering well into the thousands, 3 separate rows of boats stretching further than any one person's eye line. Surveillance footage from the dock that morning, the footage Hudson showed on camera, shows close to 24 people gathered around 3 boats before anyone even left the launch. So, if the assumption you walked in with was isolated, you can go ahead and let that one go. The island was not isolated. What happened to Nolan, whatever it turns out to be, did not happen in the kind of silence that a deserted island would have provided. And that fact cuts in 2 directions at once, because it means there were, in theory, thousands of potential witnesses out there that day, and it also means that in a crowd that size, on water that murky, a single 18-year-old separating from his friend group for a few hours would not have looked unusual to a single other person on that beach. Not every outside expert reads that crowd size the same way Tatum does, either, and the disagreement is worth including directly. At least one crime analyst consulted by News Nation took the opposite position, calling it shocking that in a crowd numbering in the thousands, not one single other person has come forward with an account of what actually happened to Nolan once he was separated from his own friend group. Both readings of the same fact are defensible. A crowd that large makes it entirely plausible nobody happened to be watching one specific young man at the exact moment that mattered. That same crowd size also makes the total absence of even one outside witness statement a genuinely strange gap in a case that has otherwise generated an enormous amount of public scrutiny. The method behind that particular piece of the story deserves scrutiny in its own right because Brandon Tatum didn't just interview Hudson in a studio. He physically walked the dock and the island with him on camera, matching his own body position to the angle of footage he says corroborates the crowd size, narrating as he went that he wanted people to be able to see for themselves rather than take his word for it. That's a genuinely unusual choice for this kind of advocacy-adjacent interview, and it deserves credit on its own terms. Showing your work, literally standing where you claim the footage was shot from, is a stronger form of verification than a talking head simply asserting a fact into a microphone. It's also worth being clear-eyed about what that method can and can't do. Standing on the beach and narrating scale demonstrates that a crowd existed. It cannot, on its own, demonstrate what happened to one specific 18-year-old inside that crowd, and Tatum's framing throughout, that thousands of witnesses somehow makes foul play less plausible, treats an assumption as though it were a conclusion. Crowds do not automatically produce witnesses to a single quiet moment inside them, and murky, chest-deep water at dusk is about as easy an environment as exists to lose track of one person without anyone noticing. So the location shot verification is real, and it does meaningfully correct the empty island myth. It does not, by itself, answer the actual question this case turns on, which is not how many people were present, but what any of them actually saw. It's also worth separating Tatum's factual claims from his framing, because the two get blended together throughout that same segment in a way that's easy to absorb without noticing. Standing on the beach, he tells his audience directly, this wasn't some abandoned, secluded island where nobody's at, and walks through the 3 rows of boats, the thousands of people, the miles of coastline packed with families. That's the factual half, and it holds up against outside reporting about the size of the 4th of July crowd on Horn Island every single year, not just this one. Woven into the same monologue, though, is a second layer that isn't a factual claim at all. It's an argument, delivered in the same even, confident tone as everything else. They're evil and they're liars, he says of the people who first reported this story without visiting the island. Pushing an agenda is wrong. That's Tatum's own editorial judgment about the motives of other journalists and commentators, not a piece of evidence, and it's worth being able to tell the difference in real time rather than letting the confidence of the delivery do the work that only actual sourcing should be doing. A crowded island is a fact you can check against other people's photos and GPS logs. Whether the people who initially covered this case as a smaller, more isolated tragedy did so out of malice, laziness, or simply working from the same limited early information everyone had in the first 72 hours, is not something a walking tour of the beach can settle, no matter how convincingly it's delivered. Before you get to the boat's mechanical failure, before you get to the moment everyone agrees Nolan chose to stay behind, There is a scuffle on the beach that has become one of the single most contested 15 minutes of this entire case, and it deserves to be walked through slowly, because this is where Hudson's account and the outside reporting genuinely start to diverge, not in tone, but in the actual facts on the table. In his interview, Hudson describes a girl running up to tell him his brother had just gotten into a fight, describes running over, finding my brother, angry, being told the other boy threw the first punch, and describes his brother taking the other kid down and putting him in an armbar. He is unambiguous, in his own words, that Nolan was nowhere near it. Absolutely not. When I was over there, it was a bunch of younger guys like my brother's age, and I never saw no one over there. Now here is what outside reporting says about what is almost certainly the same 15-minute window, because the timing, roughly 3:30 in the afternoon, and the location match closely enough that it's hard to believe these are two unrelated incidents. Rolling Stone and several other outlets have reported that a young man named Tracyston Shepard, 20 years old, a close friend of Nolan's, has publicly identified himself, by name, on the record, as the person heard yelling in the video that went viral in the days after Nolan's disappearance, the same video that a huge portion of the public came to believe showed Nolan's own voice. Shepard's account is that the fight started as a heated exchange with his girlfriend, that another young man walked by and inserted himself into it, and that the physical altercation that followed was entirely about that, nothing to do with Nolan, who Shepard says was out of frame in the water the entire time, and, at 6'2", is too tall to be the figure visible in the clip. A third friend, Javen Williams, gave TMZ a version that lines up loosely with both of the above, describing a friend getting into it and being pulled toward the boat by others trying to calm him down, with parents present on that same boat helping to get him settled. The specific physical detail Hudson adds, that his brother finished the exchange with an armbar rather than simply throwing punches, is the kind of granular texture that reads like an actual memory rather than a generic description of a fight, and it's a detail no outside account either confirms or contradicts, since none of the outside reporting describes the fight in that level of physical detail at all. Hudson also describes the immediate aftermath in distinctly unglamorous terms, pulling his brother off the beach himself, telling him directly to get in the water, calm down, hang out with the group rather than let the adrenaline carry the moment further. Ordinary older sibling de-escalation rather than anything resembling a cover-up in progress. Nowhere in any of the outside reporting does the word brother appear. So you have three different tellings sitting side by side: Hudson's, which names a literal younger brother; Shepard's, which is Shepard naming himself; and Williams's, which names an unspecified friend. It is entirely possible brother in Hudson's telling is shorthand, the kind of thing you call a close friend your whole life without meaning literal blood, and it is entirely possible these are simply two different young men getting pulled off in the same chaotic stretch of beach 15 minutes apart. Nobody outside that friend group has ever nailed down which explanation is correct, and I am not going to pretend to resolve it for you here. What matters for the case itself is the one point every single version agrees on without exception. Nolan Wells was not involved in that fight, was not near it, and multiple named, independently corroborating friends say so on the record. That same clip carries a second, far heavier claim riding on its back, and this is the one you need to hear slowly, because it is the exact kind of claim that gets treated as settled fact online within about 6 hours of posting, and it was not settled. Attorney Ben Crump, representing the Wells family, reposted the video publicly and suggested that the voice heard in it belonged to Nolan, saying something to the effect of, "Give me my freaking phone. What are you freaking doing?" That quote spread everywhere. It became, for a stretch of days, one of the most quoted last words attributed to a missing teenager in a case with almost no confirmed physical evidence at all. And then Tracyston Shepard went on the record, by name, and said the voice is his, that the altercation was about his girlfriend, not a phone, and that Nolan isn't even visible in the footage. So here's the honest state of that claim as it stands. It was floated by the family's own attorney. It was never independently corroborated by any outside source, and the one person who has stepped forward under his own name to say whose voice it actually is says it isn't Nolan's at all. That doesn't prove Crump was acting in bad faith. Attorneys advocate for their clients and sometimes get ahead of the evidence doing it. But it does mean that specific quote should never again be repeated as something Nolan Wells was heard saying, because as of everything reported to date, there is no confirmed source for it being his voice at all. Before we go further into the boat itself and the hours that actually turn this from a chaotic party into a missing persons case, it's worth pausing here because there's a lot more still ahead. The mechanical failure, the last sighting, the autopsy, the sheriff, the DA, and if any of what you've heard so far is new to you, or if you think the brother versus shepherd discrepancy deserves more digging than any outlet has done publicly, that's exactly the kind of thing worth coming back for, as this case keeps developing because it is nowhere near resolved. If you want the rest of these updates as they land, subscribing costs you nothing, and it's genuinely the only way this channel keeps being able to chase details like the ones you just heard. Now to the boat itself, because whatever you make of the fight on the beach, the mechanical emergency that followed it is not contested by anyone, not the friend group, not outside reporting, not the Coast Guard's own later paperwork. Hudson describes walking back to the Triton, popping the starboard hatch, and finding the battery completely submerged, the bilge pump, referred to on camera as the BG, failing to clear water that kept building as more and more people climbed on and off a boat that was never built to hold that many bodies for that many hours. He describes the motor trimming down and immediately floating back up, describes Wyatt, the boat's owner, throwing a rear anchor and yelling for people to calm down, describes everyone on board suddenly focused entirely on the one problem in front of them rather than on each other, and describes looking over the gunnel and seeing the pump's release hole sitting level with the waterline. None of that is secondhand. There is now an actual recording of it. Audio obtained and reported by NBC News captures a distress call made around 4 in the afternoon on July 4th, roughly an hour after the last confirmed sighting of Nolan, from the operator of the boat carrying Hudson's friend group. We're at the west tip of Horn, and our bilge pump stopped working. We're going. We're sinking. Can you all please come? That single recorded sentence does something the friend group's own retelling, however consistent, could never do on its own. It takes the single most self-serving sounding detail in their entire account. We had to leave because the boat was sinking, and turns it into a matter of public record, captured on tape, in real time, hours before anyone had a motive to invent an excuse. Whatever else is unresolved in this case, the boat trouble is not the part anyone needs to take on faith anymore. The mechanical crisis itself unfolded in stages, by Hudson's account, rather than as a single sudden moment, and the stages matter because they explain why leaving the island took as long as it did once the decision was actually made. First, it was Wyatt trying to trim the motor down from the console, watching it drop and then float straight back up because the electrical system feeding it was sitting under seawater. Then it was Wyatt jumping into the water himself to try to throw a rear anchor by hand while people around him kept climbing on and off a boat that was already sitting dangerously low. Then it was Hudson himself looking over the gunnel and realizing the bilge pump's own release hole, the exact point where excess water is supposed to exit the hull, was sitting flush with the waterline outside the boat, meaning the pump wasn't just broken, it had become physically incapable of doing its job even if it started working again, because there was nowhere left for the water to go. A second boat, a 24-foot tidewater belonging to a friend Hudson calls Bart, ended up doing the actual work of pulling the Triton clear of the crowded anchorage, rigging a tow strap to a stern cleat, easing up alongside, riding close enough that the hulls were bumping against each other's power pole mounts in water that was, by then, choppier than it had been on the way out that morning. None of that is a small detail dressed up to sound dramatic. A 22-foot boat with a dead battery, a failed bilge pump, and water at the transom, still carrying passengers, being towed away from a beach packed with thousands of people while its owner works the problem in real time, is a genuine, recorded, corroborated emergency. And it's the reason nobody on that boat was thinking about a single missing 18-year-old in the specific 20 minutes right after he told them he was staying behind. They were, in Hudson's words, all focused on one thing: whether the boat itself was going to make it back to the mainland at all. It's what happens in the 15 or 20 minutes after that distress call that carries the actual weight of this entire story, because this is the last confirmed sighting of Nolan Wells alive, and both the friend group's account and outside reporting land on the same broad shape of it, even if the texture differs. Attorney Ben Crump's own office has stated that Nolan was last seen on the island at 3 in the afternoon. Hudson's account puts his own last direct interaction with Nolan earlier than that, describing Nolan cradling a girl in his arms, Katie, the two of them joking around, Nolan shaking his head and laughing. What both accounts agree happened next is that as the boat was being prepared to leave, with the bilge pump failing and the water rising, someone, by Hudson's account it was Wyatt, called out to Nolan repeatedly, not once, according to Hudson, but multiple times, shouting for him directly by name to get on the boat, that the boat was having issues, that if he was coming he needed to come now, right now, not in a minute. And Nolan said no. He said he was staying, that he'd ride in with somebody else, a phrase Hudson insists was not unusual for that friend group on a day like that one, and Katie, the girl he'd been with, has since been identified by name as Katie McCormack, 19 years old, and has become a named figure in this case in her own right, because according to Hudson, she texted a friend the following day describing that exact same moment, hearing people yell for Nolan to get on the boat and watching him choose to stay. Here is where this case takes its sharpest turn yet, and it is not a turn built on speculation. It is built on Katie's own words to investigators, reported independently of anything Hudson or any other friend has said. Attorney Ben Crump has stated publicly that one young woman told him Nolan said he was heading back to get on his friend's boat, directly contradicting what the friend group has maintained from the very first interview in this series. And more recently, Katie herself has told authorities the same thing directly, that after their conversation, Nolan said he was going back to the boat with his friends, not that he was staying behind with her. Read that against everything Hudson has said across 4 separate parts of the series, that Nolan refused multiple direct pleas to get on the boat and chose, deliberately, to stay, and you have 2 accounts that cannot both be the plain, complete truth at the same time. Either Nolan changed his mind in the gap between talking to Katie and the boat actually pulling away, which is entirely possible given how chaotic and rushed that final stretch clearly was, or one of these 2 accounts, Hudson's or Katie's, is simply wrong about what Nolan intended in his final confirmed conversation before he was never seen again. Nolan's own family has said publicly that these conflicting versions of what Katie was told, and what she has since told investigators, don't add up, and that's a completely reasonable reaction to have, because this is not a minor detail sitting at the edge of the story. It is the single most important fact in the entire case, whether Nolan meant to get back on that boat or not. And right now, the 2 people closest to that exact moment, his best friend and the girl he was with, are describing 2 different intentions entirely. Katie McCormack's own sister, Gracie, has since spoken publicly on the family's behalf, and her account lines up with what Katie herself reportedly told investigators, not with what Hudson's friend group has maintained. That Katie believed Nolan intended to head back to the mainland with his friends, that she assumed they simply wouldn't leave him behind, and that Katie herself eventually left the island separately with her own family members who had arrived later that day. Notably, nobody in this case, not Hudson, not Crump, not Katie's own sister, has accused Katie McCormack of any wrongdoing, and Nolan's own family has publicly voiced support for her rather than treating her as a suspect in anything. That matters, because it means this contradiction isn't being framed by anyone involved as evidence that Katie did something wrong. It's being framed, correctly, as evidence that somebody's memory or somebody's account of one specific conversation doesn't match the other, and nobody has offered a clean explanation yet for why. Even identifying exactly who the girl is has not been entirely clean in the outside reporting, which is worth flagging on its own as a small but genuine illustration of how much confusion has surrounded this case at every level, not just among online commentators, but inside the actual investigative record. Reporting on the case has separately referenced a woman named Lainey, described as someone originally reported to have been on Horn Island with a group that included Nolan, whose residence investigators visited as part of their work. Whether Lainey and Katie are the same person known by 2 different names in different accounts, or 2 entirely separate young women who were each connected to the group in some way that day, has never been clearly resolved in anything publicly reported. That kind of confusion over something as basic as how many named women were actually involved in Nolan's final hours and which one said what, is exactly the sort of detail that should make anyone, including everyone watching this video, slower to treat any single secondhand claim in this case as settled until it's been attached to one clearly identified person telling one clearly documented account. Ben Crump has separately raised 2 more claims that haven't been folded into this account yet, and both deserve to be stated plainly, labeled clearly as his characterization rather than independently confirmed fact, since neither has been corroborated by anyone else on the record. He has said there was a big argument on the boat tied to peer pressure, framing it as Nolan making clear he didn't want to be pushed into using anything that would show up in a system, a specific and serious claim about substance pressure that no friend in any of the 4 interviews across this series has mentioned or been asked about directly. He has also given a more specific account of the phone than it stayed on the boat, saying Nolan's phone was recovered not from his body, but from the possession of one of the young men who made the trip with him, and that Christine Wells Wansley located it herself using a location-sharing app before noticing what she believed were deleted messages. That's a meaningfully more specific claim than the general phone stay on the boat explanation this video has already examined, and if accurate, it would mean the phone's location that night is a matter of who was holding it and when, not simply where it happened to be sitting on a console. Neither of these 2 claims has been confirmed by outside reporting beyond Crump's own statements, and neither has been directly addressed by Hudson or anyone else in the friend group across any of the interviews this series has drawn from. That doesn't make them false. It means they're sitting exactly where several other claims in this case sit, asserted by one side, unaddressed by the other, and unresolved by anyone in a position to settle them. The substance pressure claim specifically deserves a slower read than a quick mention allows, because if true, it would mean the day held a second, entirely separate point of tension beyond the beach altercation, one that has never been named on camera by a single person actually present on that boat. It would also, if true, complicate that everyone was just drinking and having a normal holiday, framing this entire friend group has offered consistently across 4 interviews. None of that makes the claim true. It makes it a claim worth watching for confirmation or denial the same way everything else here has been watched, rather than either dismissing it because it's inconvenient to the friend group's account or accepting it because it's convenient to the families. It's also worth noticing that this specific claim sits in some tension with the character portrait built earlier in this account. The young man his coach described as someone who did things the right way in the classroom and in practice. The friend Hudson says never once argued with anyone in 8 years. A person can be exactly that kind of steady, well-regarded presence and still, in one specific moment on one specific boat, push back against pressure to use something he didn't want to use. Those 2 things aren't actually in conflict at all. What would be in conflict is if that pressure came from within the same tight, decade-long friend group Hudson has spent 4 interviews describing as close as family, and that's the piece of Crump's claim that would carry the most weight if it were ever independently confirmed, not the substance itself, but who, if anyone, was doing the pushing. There is, notably, a piece of physical evidence that could speak to this specific claim more directly than any interview ever could: toxicology results from Nolan's own body. As of this recording, the Jackson County Sheriff's Department's own toxicology findings have not been made public, which means the one piece of evidence best positioned to confirm or quietly close out the substance pressure question sits in exactly the same place as everything else in this case, still marked undetermined. Television commentary has weighed in on this exact contradiction too, and it's worth including one specific instance because of how bluntly it states what this video has spent considerable time working through more carefully. On her Crime Stories program on July 20th, former prosecutor Nancy Grace laid out the Katie versus friend group conflict and didn't hedge about what it meant. Both cannot be true. Those cannot mutually exist in truth. They're mutually exclusive. He can't go with them and stay with her on Horn Island. I don't know who's lying, but somebody's lying right there. That's a sharper way of stating exactly the contradiction laid out earlier in this video, and it's worth crediting for its bluntness while also noting what it doesn't do. Naming that a contradiction exists and naming which side is lying are 2 entirely different tasks, and even a career prosecutor with decades of experience reading conflicting witness accounts stopped short of claiming to know which one it was. Katie's position in this case deserves more attention than it's gotten, because she is, by every account given so far, the single person best positioned to answer the question this case keeps circling back to, and unlike almost everyone else at the center of the story, she has not given her account through a sympathetic commentator or a friend's retelling. She has given it to investigators directly, which is a meaningfully stronger form of evidence than anything Hudson, Shepard, or Williams have offered on camera, all of which came filtered through an interviewer either the friend group chose or a platform the friend group trusted. That doesn't automatically make her account more truthful than Hudson's. Memory can fail an eyewitness giving a police statement just as easily as it can fail a friend giving a television interview, and being questioned by investigators in the days after a friend's death is its own kind of high-pressure, imperfect memory situation. But it does mean her version carries a different, more institutionally accountable weight than Hudson's does, since a statement given to investigators becomes part of a formal record that can be checked against other evidence, questioned under oath, and revisited if new information surfaces. In a way, an on-camera interview with a sympathetic host was never built to be. What's actually missing isn't Katie's account. It's Katie's account in a form the public can independently examine and weigh for itself, the same way this video has tried to weigh everything else, rather than relying entirely on second-hand characterizations of what she supposedly told Ben Crump's office, or what she supposedly told investigators. Until that happens, the contradiction between her version and Hudson's remains exactly what it is: a real, confirmed, unresolved conflict between the two accounts that matter most, sitting at the center of the single most consequential decision in this entire case. That decision, staying behind expecting a ride from someone else, is not treated by the friend group as strange, and it's worth understanding why, because the explanation touches on something else that later became suspicious to a national audience for reasons that turn out to be almost entirely cultural rather than sinister. Hudson describes it as extremely common at Horn Island, dozens of people every holiday riding out with one group and back with another, nothing that would have registered to anyone at the time as a red flag, and he goes further than that in his own account, saying he could personally name somewhere around 50 people on the island that same day who rode out with one group and rode back with another. That specific number is worth pressure testing rather than accepting purely on the strength of how confidently it's delivered. It's a plausible claim about how a crowded holiday gathering actually functions, since with thousands of people and dozens of overlapping boats and friend groups, it would be genuinely unusual if nobody ever caught a ride home with someone other than who they arrived with. It's also, notably, an unfalsifiable claim in the specific form Hudson offers it, a round figure pulled from memory with no actual list of 50 names attached, offered as reassurance rather than as documented fact. Neither observation cancels the other out. The claim doesn't need to be exactly 50 people to be broadly true as a description of how these gatherings work, and it also shouldn't be treated as independently confirmed simply because it's stated with total confidence on camera by someone with an obvious interest in the story it supports. The same logic applies to the detail that ended up fueling some of the loudest online speculation of all: why Nolan's phone stayed behind on the boat rather than going missing with him. Both Hudson and, separately, other friends interviewed on location by Tatum describe the same basic reality of a day spent chest-deep or waist-deep in murky, rain-churned saltwater. Nobody carries a phone in their hand while swimming. Phones live on the boat console all day regardless of whose they are, and the console of the Triton, by Hudson's account, was covered in devices belonging to people who couldn't even remember which one was whose. None of that is a claim unique to this friend group defending itself. It's a description of how every boat full of teenagers at every barrier island on the Gulf Coast behaves on a holiday weekend, and it lines up with the ordinary, unremarkable behavior you'd expect from any of the roughly 20 other people who were also on that boat that day, and who have not been accused of anything. That phone detail deserves one more layer of digging, since it became one of the loudest pieces of online speculation in the entire case, and the actual explanation, once you sit with it, is almost anticlimactic compared to how it was treated. In the second interview in this series, Hudson was asked directly, more than once, whether it was typical for people to leave their phones behind, and whether Nolan's was the only one left on the boat that day. His answer both times was essentially the same: no, absolutely not. There were phones scattered across the console of every boat in that group, so many that friends couldn't always identify whose was whose, and with 20-plus people spread across 3 boats, of course, every one of them had a device sitting somewhere other than in their own hand. He describes the water that day as murky enough from recent rain that dropping a phone in it would likely mean losing it permanently, a practical deterrent as much as a habit, and notes that saltwater itself ends most phones' lives the moment they go under regardless of how murky the water is. One more reason nobody treated a phone as something to carry around chest deep in the surf. And he describes the handful of times people did bring a phone into the water as quick, deliberate moments, hopping out to snap a photo, and immediately putting the device back rather than standing around scrolling chest deep in saltwater. None of that is a claim that requires taking Hudson's word alone. It's consistent with how literally anyone who has spent a holiday on a Gulf Coast sandbar describes those same days. Phones baking on a console under a towel while everyone stays in the water for hours at a stretch. And it's the kind of mundane, low-stakes detail that only ever looks suspicious once a tragedy retroactively assigns significance to it. A phone left behind on a boat isn't evidence of anything by itself. It's what happens to nearly every phone at nearly every one of these gatherings for nearly everyone who is there, not just for the one person who never made it home. Ben Crump has made exactly the opposite argument publicly, and it deserves to be weighed directly rather than skipped past in favor of the friend group's explanation. It's very implausible that Nolan would have not wanted his cell phone with him if he was going to stay on the island, Crump has said, and the logic underneath that sentence is straightforward. If you're planning to spend the rest of the night with someone rather than heading home with your ride, a phone is exactly the thing you'd want on you, to coordinate a way back later, to check in with your own family, to have some way of reaching anyone at all. That's a genuinely reasonable point, and it sits in real tension with the everybody's phone was on the boat all day explanation Hudson and others have offered, because everyone leaves their phone on the boat while swimming is a description of the entire afternoon, not specifically of the final decision to stay behind as the boat was actively leaving. Both things can be true without fully resolving each other. It can be accurate that phones generally stayed on boats all day at Horn Island, and it can still be a legitimate question why, in the specific moment Nolan decided to remain on the island rather than leave, he didn't take a few seconds to grab the one device that would have let him reach anyone once his friends were gone. Neither this video nor anyone else currently has a confirmed answer to that specific, narrower question, and it's worth naming as its own open point rather than letting the broader phone culture explanation quietly answer a question it doesn't actually address. The physical geography of where all of this happened matters more than most coverage has given it credit for, and it's worth walking through plainly, because it bears directly on how someone could end up in open water without anyone seeing it happen. Horn Island itself has no shelters, no facilities, and no reliable communications infrastructure of any kind. A barrier island that exists entirely as raw sand, scrub, and water, which is precisely why cell coverage there was as unreliable as Hudson describes and why anyone separated from their group after dark was, in a very literal sense, on their own until someone else noticed. Even the boats themselves, by Hudson's account, were anchored bow and stern right at that same steep drop-off, close enough that stepping off the bow put you in water up to your neck, while stepping off the stern left you only waist deep, a gradient steep enough to disorient sober people in daylight, let alone anyone tired, intoxicated, and moving through it after dark. By Hudson and Tatum's shared description, the drop-off just off the northwestern tip of Horn Island goes from waist deep to neck deep within a matter of feet, and from neck deep to somewhere between 17 and 20 feet of water, not far past that, a genuinely steep and disorienting gradient for anyone who has been drinking, swimming, and standing in the sun for the better part of 8 hours. The water that day, both men note, was murkier than usual because of recent rain, cutting visibility down to almost nothing beneath the surface. Brian Troshers, vice president of the volunteer search and rescue group the United Cajun Navy, has since told reporters that Nolan's body was found face down, washed right back, close to where he was last seen, and said plainly, "The wind and drift patterns tell a story," consistent with a theory that a rip current initially pulled him further out before a shift in the tide carried him back toward shore, a mechanism that would explain both the direction of the search and the ultimate discovery. Location without requiring anyone else's involvement at all. Troshers was careful to frame this as his own organization's working theory rather than an official finding, since the United Cajun Navy is a volunteer search and rescue group assisting the search, not the agency actually leading the criminal investigation, a distinction worth keeping in mind given how often his comments have been treated online as though they carried the same authority as an official determination. Sheriff Ledbetter has said publicly that based on everyone investigators have spoken to, the working understanding is that Nolan simply stayed behind expecting to catch a ride back with someone else, and never got the chance to. Nolan's family has pushed back hard against the drowning explanation specifically, telling reporters that their son was a strong swimmer and that the currents alone don't sit right with them as a full accounting of what happened. Both of those positions can be true at the same time without canceling each other out. A strong swimmer can still drown in a steep drop-off at night. Exhausted, intoxicated, and disoriented in water he couldn't see through, and a family who watched their son grow up in the water has every right to find that explanation insufficient anyway, because statistically possible and emotionally satisfying are not the same bar. And grief was never going to be satisfied by a current chart. There is a piece of this that has taken on a strange second life online, entirely separate from anything that happened on July 4th, and it deserves to be dealt with plainly, because it's a clean example of how misinformation in this case has moved in both directions, not just from people defending the friend group, but from material connected to the family's own side too. A photo has circulated widely showing Nolan submerged in a swimming pool, arms out, an image that a significant portion of social media came to believe was taken during or immediately connected to the trip itself. Evidence, to some, that something dark had already started before anyone left the dock. Hudson addresses it directly on camera. The photo, he says, was taken June 27th, a full week before the 4th of July, at a friend's house in Pass Christian, and he says you can see his own arm around Nolan in the same frame. Outside reporting backs this up almost exactly. Coverage of the family's meeting with the district attorney specifically flagged that same image as a documented piece of misinformation in the case, an Instagram photo from roughly a month before the disappearance that had been recirculated as though it were contemporaneous with it. Part of a wider wave of confusion the DA's office says has included AI-generated photos and videos, some of them targeting Nolan's own parents. So on this particular point, independently reported fact and the friend group's own explanation land in the same place. That photo predates the trip, and whatever it shows, it isn't evidence of anything that happened on Horn Island. What happened after the boat actually got moving is where the physical danger, briefly, became less about Nolan and more about everyone still on that Triton. And it's worth walking through because it explains a detail that later became one more point of public suspicion. Why nobody called for help about Nolan specifically for several more hours. Hudson describes planing the boat off once Wyatt got the motor trimmed and the plug pulled, describes moving everyone's weight toward the bow so the hull could rise up onto plane at speed, describes the built-up water finally draining out the back once they were moving fast enough, describes stopping briefly in Fort Bayou so Wyatt could jump in and reseal the plug, then finally docking, going back to a friend's house to eat, and, in his own word, nap for a while after what had already been a long day at the island. GPS records obtained later by reporters track that exact sequence almost to the minute. The boat left Horn Island at 4:31 in the afternoon, reached Fort Bayou by 5:52, was back at the dock by 6:06, and by 7:19 that evening had been trailered and was on its way, by road, to the boat owner's home in Biloxi. It's a mechanically precise, independently generated timeline that matches, almost beat for beat, the sequence Hudson lays out from memory, and that kind of alignment between a friend's recollection and cold hardware data is not something you get by accident or by rehearsal. It's the strongest single piece of corroboration his account has going for it anywhere in this case, and it exists because the people who own that data chose not to fight releasing it. On July 8th, investigators met separately with Jerry Atkerson and Jennifer Pyron, the grandfather and mother of Wyatt Pyron, and Jerry signed the documents authorizing officers to search the family's boat and pull its GPS data directly, and investigators did the same with Bart Edmiston Jr. regarding his own boat. Cooperation like that, two separate families voluntarily handing over the exact data that ended up confirming their own son's account of the day, doesn't prove innocence by itself, and it shouldn't be read as though it does. It does mean the single most objective, hardest-to-fake piece of evidence in this entire case was made available to investigators promptly and without a fight, rather than resisted, which is a meaningfully different posture than what a family actively trying to hide something would typically choose. Hudson describes his own first formal interview with the lead investigator as happening on July 7th, telling his account, in his own words, top to bottom, leaving out no detail he could remember, and says every single person in the friend group who'd been out there that day cooperated fully with police from the first time investigators reached out. Not just Hudson, not just the boys who ended up facing the most public scrutiny. It was hours later, at a friend's pool party that evening, not connected in any way to the earlier photo, that Hudson says the group first started actively wondering where Nolan was, texting around, hearing nothing back from him or from anyone who'd seen him. What follows is a sequence that outside reporting has now nailed down almost to the minute, and it's worth laying next to Hudson's own account because here, too, the two mostly line up. Hudson describes texting Javon and a couple of other friends first, asking plainly whether anyone had heard from Nolan or seen him ride in with somebody else, and getting nothing back but no from all of them, before texting Javon again for Nolan's mother's phone number, walking down to a dock away from the party to make the call in private, and reaching Christine only on his second attempt. Reporting confirms that Christine Wells Wansley received a call that night from a friend of Nolan's named Warren at 11:07 p.m., the first call she says she received about her son from anyone. Hudson places his own call to the Coast Guard at about 11 o'clock, close enough to that timestamp that it's clearly the same sequence of events being described from two different sides of the same phone call. What the outside record adds, and this is a detail Hudson's account doesn't quite capture the weight of, is what happened on the Coast Guard's end after that first call. The Coast Guard's own determination that night was that the situation, as reported to them, did not require Coast Guard assistance. It was not until 12:26 the following afternoon, more than 13 hours later, that Coast Guard Sector Mobile received a formal request for assistance from the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, triggering an urgent marine broadcast and a helicopter search. That gap, midnight to lunchtime the next day, sits almost entirely outside anything Hudson was in a position to control once he made that first call, and it is one of the clearest points in this entire timeline where the system's own response, not the friend group's choices, becomes the thing worth scrutinizing. That gap is easier to understand, though not necessarily easier to accept, once you know how jurisdiction actually works on a case like this one. The United States Coast Guard is a federal maritime search and rescue authority, and its first-line judgment on any given night is whether a report describes an active emergency in progress, a boat currently in distress, a swimmer currently missing in open water, something with a clock running on it. A report that a young man chose to stay behind on an island hours earlier and simply hasn't checked in since, however alarming it feels to the person making that call at 11 at night, doesn't necessarily read to a duty officer as that kind of live emergency, especially before any local agency has formally classified him as missing. That initial determination is not the same thing as indifference, and it's also not the same thing as due diligence being satisfied. What actually mobilizes a full-scale search, the helicopters, the marine broadcast, the DMR boats fanning out across 4 separate islands, is a state or local agency, in this case the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, formally requesting federal assistance, which is exactly what happened at 12:26 the following afternoon. The honest reading of that 13-hour gap isn't that the Coast Guard refused to help a family in crisis. It's that the handoff between a friend is worried and calling around at midnight and multiple government agencies have classified this as an active missing person search took longer than anyone watching from the outside, then or now, would consider acceptable, and nobody in this case, not the Sheriff's Office, not the Coast Guard, not the family, has ever suggested that 13-hour window is anything other than a legitimate place to ask harder questions. The search that followed, once it actually began, was not a quiet one. And this matters because part of the public suspicion around this case has rested on an assumption that law enforcement dragged its feet visibly in a way people could see happening in real time. The morning that search actually began, by Hudson's own account, started the same ordinary way a lot of the worst mornings do, with someone else noticing first. He describes waking up around 7:30 to a text from his own father, who had already seen Nolan's photos spreading across Facebook, describes his stepfather walking into his room, asking whether there'd been any word, describes assuming, the way anyone would want to, that Nolan had simply crashed somewhere after a long day of drinking, and would turn up fine. He didn't let himself fully believe that, in his own telling, but he also didn't want to believe anything worse without real information. Within a short window that same morning, he pulled together a group of his own, friends he names as Ricky, Brooks, and Jax, along with his mother and stepfather, and taken his family's own boat out to join the search personally rather than waiting at home for updates from official channels. That's the scene he describes arriving into. Not 1 or 2 patrol boats making a courtesy pass, but dozens of Department of Marine Resources vessels working the water simultaneously, helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft overhead. A search presence he describes covering not just Horn Island but Ship Island, Chandela, and Petit Bois at the same time. The whole nine. In his words, not a token effort mounted to quiet a worried family down. A park ranger found a body on the northwestern tip of Horn Island on the morning of Monday, July 6th, roughly 2 days after Nolan was last seen. The Ocean Springs School District confirmed shortly after that the body was Nolan Wells. Hudson's own reaction. Learning the news secondhand through a phone call from a friend he calls track while riding in a car with another friend, Brooks, breaking down on Brooks's shoulder right there, is the one part of his entire interview that no outside source can verify or dispute because grief doesn't leave a paper trail and it doesn't need one. He describes making a round of calls to check on the rest of his friends immediately afterward, before he'd even fully processed the news himself, which is its own small, human detail about how that specific morning actually went for him. Grief wasn't the only reaction inside Nolan's own family, and the other one deserves to be heard just as directly, because it's the earliest public sign that not everyone close to Nolan was willing to accept the shape the story was taking. His grandfather, Christopher Wells Sr., posted a series of messages on Facebook within days of the body's discovery, writing plainly, "Too many unanswered questions. How can an island that was searched yesterday produce my grandson's body this morning?" And, separately, "There's nothing right about this. Nolan Xavier Wells deserved the same things that people he knew and associated with will enjoy in life." He also asked a direct, pointed question that outside reporting has never fully answered since. Where's the video of the big fight that occurred Saturday evening before everyone left the island? That specific framing, evening rather than mid-afternoon, is worth flagging as its own small discrepancy sitting alongside the brother versus shepherd one, since every other account in this case places the beach altercation around 3:30 in the afternoon, hours before the boat actually departed at 4:31. Whether that's simply an imprecise word choice from a grieving grandfather posting in real time, or a genuine difference in when he believes events actually occurred, isn't something this video can resolve. What it does establish is that suspicion in this case never came only from outside advocates or online strangers. It came, first and loudest, from inside Nolan's own family, from a grandfather demanding to see footage nobody has ever produced. Ben Crump has raised a second, more technical version of that same discovery timing suspicion, and it's worth stating plainly rather than folding it into the broader, "so many inconsistencies" label he's used publicly. His question is why, if Nolan's body entered the water on July 4th and tidal movement was going to carry it somewhere, it surfaced on the morning of July 6th rather than the 5th, a full search day earlier. That's one of those things that's just not adding up, Crump has said. That's a legitimate question for a marine search expert to answer with actual current and tide data specific to that stretch of water on those exact days, and as of this recording, no such detailed technical explanation has been made public by investigators. It's also worth noting, without treating this as a rebuttal, that a rip current pulling a body further from shore before a tidal shift eventually pushed it back, the same general mechanism a rescuer on scene has already pointed to, could plausibly account for a body not surfacing on the very first full day of searching without requiring anything more sinister than ordinary Gulf currents working unpredictably over a barrier island's edge. Plausible is not the same as confirmed, though, and until someone with actual expertise in Horn Island's specific tidal patterns addresses Crump's question directly, it stays exactly where the rest of this case's harder questions sit: open, legitimate, and unanswered by anyone with the authority to answer it. The scale of that search is worth understanding in its own right, because a multi-agency operation spanning 4 separate barrier islands doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen quietly. Horn Island, along with Ship Island, Petit Bois, and the Chandelier chain further west, sits inside the Gulf Island's national seashore, a stretch of coastline that falls under a genuinely tangled web of overlapping jurisdiction: the National Park Service for the islands themselves, the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources for state waters immediately surrounding them, the Jackson County Sheriff's Office for the broader missing person investigation once one is formally opened, and the Coast Guard for Federal Search and Rescue Authority once it's been called in. Coordinating a search across all 4 of those agencies, over water that stretches for miles between islands, with currents that shift by the hour and visibility that was, by every account, worse than usual because of recent rain, is not a simple operation, and the presence of dozens of boats plus helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft, in Hudson's own description, reflects genuine resource commitment rather than a token gesture, and Hudson's own description of the water itself that morning. The drop from waist-deep to neck-deep in a matter of feet and down to somewhere around 30 feet not far past that gives some sense of just how much open water 4 separate agencies were actually covering. That doesn't mean every question about the pace of the investigation gets answered by pointing at the size of the search effort. Finding a body 2 days after a disappearance, in water that size, with that many agencies involved, is not unusually slow by the standards of similar cases nationally. It's the gap before the search began, not the search itself once it started, that has remained the more legitimate point of scrutiny throughout this entire case. One detail from that same Cajun Navy search effort has only surfaced recently, and it's a genuinely unusual piece of this story worth including on its own. Troshers was flying aerial photography from roughly 400 feet on the morning of July 6th, documenting the search response as his organization has done in disaster and missing person cases across the Gulf Coast for years, and he has said publicly that he didn't realize at the time that Nolan's body was actually visible in those photographs until later. His organization has since agreed to share those images and walk Christine Wells Wansley through exactly what they show, in person, at her own request, rather than through a secondhand description or a leaked copy circulating online. That a mother would need to ask a volunteer search group, rather than the official investigation itself, for a direct accounting of what exists in photographs of where her son's body was found says something about how this family has experienced the flow of information in this case from the very beginning, regardless of how legitimate the reasons for official caution have been. Before this moves into the funeral, the autopsy, and everything the last 3 weeks have turned into publicly, it's worth taking a breath here, the way any honest account of a death like this one has to. A body has just been recovered. A mother who kissed her son goodbye that morning is now planning to bury him. That's not a place to rush past on the way to the next controversy, and it's not a place to hang an ask on top of, either, so this is simply a marker. If the rest of what follows here, the funeral, the forensic findings, the fallout with the sheriff's department, the still unresolved question about his phone, is the kind of ongoing coverage worth following as it develops rather than catching secondhand once it's already been chewed up by commentary, that's what subscribing to this channel actually gets you, and it's worth doing before we move forward, not in place of what comes next. Hundreds of people gathered at Center Point Church in Ocean Springs for Nolan's funeral, a service that was live-streamed and watched by communities well beyond Mississippi, coverage substantial enough that Canada's CBC News ran its own explainer asking why an 18-year-old's death on a Mississippi barrier island had become international news at all, and the service itself was led in eulogy by the Reverend Al Sharpton, who used the platform not just to remember Nolan, but to escalate the pressure on investigators. In the days around the funeral, Sharpton, Tyler Perry, and former NFL wide receiver Terrell Owens jointly put up a reward, growing to $125,000 total for information leading to an arrest or conviction in the case. That single detail, a six-figure reward now sitting on the table for anyone with usable information, is itself a fact worth registering plainly. It means, as of this recording, this case is not simply a matter of competing narratives online. It is an active investigation with a financial incentive now attached to producing new evidence. And any accounts that surface from here forward will need to be weighed with that incentive in mind, the same way any piece of testimony in any high-profile case has to be. Christine Wells Wansley spoke at the service herself, opening by giving thanks for the beautiful 18 years that you blessed us with him, and describing her son in words that, notably, echo almost exactly what Warren Hudson has said about him independently, months and interviews apart. He had a way of making people feel seen, welcomed, and valued. He could lift your confidence with just a few words and make you feel like you belong. She closed with a line that has since been repeated across nearly every outlet that covered the service. "Nolan, we love you. We'll continue to fight for you, and until we meet again." It's a striking thing when you actually put the two accounts side by side, that his mother's description of her son's effect on the people around him and his best friend's description of that same effect are almost word for word, describing the same person. Whatever else remains contested in this case, That particular detail about who Nolan Wells was as a human being is not one of them. There's a thread worth noticing running through exactly who has stepped in to support this family financially, because it isn't random, and it isn't limited to the traditional civil rights infrastructure of an attorney and a reverend. Colin Kaepernick, who quietly funded Dr. Mitchell's exam, and Terrell Owens, who helped fund the reward alongside Sharpton and Perry, are both former professional football players, and Nolan Wells was, before any of this happened, a working student athlete himself, a wide receiver whose own coach was still describing him in terms of practice habits and locker room character weeks after his death. That's not a coincidence anyone has stated outright, but it's a pattern worth naming. Current and former athletes, the same profession Nolan was actively pursuing at Southwest Mississippi Community College, have been among the first outside figures to put real resources behind this family, long before most of the general public had heard his name. It's worth remembering that none of that support required Nolan to have already become a household name. Athletes and entertainers with genuine standing chose to attach themselves to a story that, at the time, belonged almost entirely to Ocean Springs. The grief did not stay contained to a single church service, and it's worth understanding how it moved through the wider community, because the public pressure campaign around this case has never been driven by outside activists parachuting in. It has been driven from the beginning by the people who actually live in Ocean Springs. Ocean Springs is a town of roughly 19,000 people, an arts community regularly ranked among the country's happiest and most livable small seaside towns. The kind of place where a graduating multi-sport athlete signing to play college football is genuinely a community event, cheered on at Friday night games by people who'd known him his whole life. That scale matters for understanding why this case tore through its hometown the way it did. 19,000 people is small enough that a single funeral, a single protest, a single missing teenager touches nearly everyone at least once removed, and it's exactly why outside agitators was never a credible explanation for why this case grew as large, as fast, as it did close to home. Hundreds gathered peacefully at the intersection of government and state streets in the days before the funeral, carrying handmade signs, chanting Nolan's name, demanding transparency from an investigation that, by then, had already stretched more than a week without a clear public accounting of what happened. The crowd skewed across generations, not just Nolan's own peers, and one older resident's comment to a local outlet has been quoted widely since, capturing something the case's national coverage often flattens out. Nolan Wells could have easily been my grandson. A former football coach of Nolan's described the town as still fundamentally in disbelief, trying to hold itself together enough to support a grieving family while the actual facts of what happened remained genuinely unresolved. A description that matches almost exactly how Warren Hudson describes his own friend group in the days after. Everyone checking in on everyone else. Nobody quite able to process it all at once. None of that community reaction resolves a single disputed fact in this case. It does establish something that matters for how you should weigh everything else here. This was never purely a story manufactured by national media or amplified by outside attorneys looking for a platform. It is, first and most fundamentally, a hometown's grief for one of its own, and every other layer of the story sits on top of that, not the other way around. That grief was met, in the days just before the funeral, with something uglier, and it belongs in this account precisely because it shows the intimidation running through this case has never moved in only one direction. Christine Wells Wansley revealed that someone had anonymously mailed her family a piece of hate mail featuring images of Reverend Al Sharpton and Ben Crump with large dollar signs superimposed over their faces, a racist trope aimed at suggesting Black advocates profit from a family's tragedy. Her own response, released publicly, is worth hearing in full rather than summarized. "Whoever sent this to my home, may the good Lord have mercy on your soul. Bold enough to send this crap, but not bold enough to list your return address. This is America, where a grieving mother and father have to deal with this type of behavior because we asked a simple question of what happened to our son and accepted all the help we could get to find answers. Please go touch some grass." Set that next to Warren Hudson's own description. In this same series, of friends too frightened by threats of violence to speak publicly at all, and the shape of what's actually surrounded this case comes into focus. A grieving family targeted with anonymous racist mail for asking questions, and a friend group facing threats serious enough to keep some of them silent for asking to be heard. Neither of those facts cancels the other out, and neither should be used to minimize the other. Both are simply true, and both describe the same ugly reality that a real family's grief over a real dead 18-year-old became, for some segment of the public, an occasion to threaten people rather than to think clearly. Notice how a case like this typically ends up on a national stage in the first place, because that trajectory has become familiar enough over the last several years that it can look, from a distance, like an outside machine parachuting into manufacture controversy where none existed locally. That is almost never actually how it works, and it isn't how it worked here either. The pattern generally starts exactly the way it did in Ocean Springs, a hometown protest, a community's own frustration with how quickly local officials characterized a death, neighbors organizing on their own initiative before a single national attorney or advocacy figure ever gets a phone call. Ben Crump has represented families in a long list of other cases that received national attention over the years, and Reverend Al Sharpton has built decades of a public career around exactly this kind of advocacy. Showing up once a local case has already generated enough sustained community pressure that a family reaches out looking for a bigger platform and more resources than a small-town legal fight can usually provide on its own. That's a meaningful, well-documented, and entirely legitimate role for national advocates to play. It's also worth being clear-eyed that neither Crump's involvement nor Sharpton's changes what the physical evidence actually shows, and neither should be mistaken for an independent confirmation of any specific factual claim in this case. Their presence tells you a family felt they weren't getting enough answers locally. It doesn't on its own tell you what those answers eventually turn out to be. It's also worth noting plainly that Sharpton's own role in this case followed the same general shape his public career has followed for decades, showing up once local pressure had already reached a point where a family wanted a bigger platform, using a eulogy not just to grieve but to apply public pressure, and attaching tangible financial weight, in this instance by helping secure a reward, to a case that risked fading from the national conversation the way so many others eventually do. That's a well-established, entirely public pattern, not a hidden agenda, and it says nothing one way or the other about the underlying facts of what happened to Nolan Wells specifically. What it does mean is that his presence at that pulpit is itself a form of evidence about how large this case had already grown by the time of the funeral, not a form of evidence about the autopsy, the phone, or the beach. There is a version of this story where the physical evidence, once an autopsy is done, simply answers the remaining questions, and that is not the version that actually happened here, which is exactly why this case has stayed this loud, this long, 3 full weeks after Nolan's body was recovered. The official autopsy findings have not been made fully public in detail, but the family, through Ben Crump's office, commissioned an independent autopsy performed by Dr. Roger Mitchell, a board-certified forensic pathologist, the former chief medical examiner for the District of Columbia, and the current president of the National Medical Association, the oldest and largest professional organization of Black physicians in the country. That credential matters here specifically because it heads off one obvious objection before it can even be raised. This was not an amateur or an advocate with a medical degree of convenience. It was a credentialed, previously government-employed forensic pathologist conducting the kind of exam he has performed professionally for years, and his findings, from an exam actually conducted on July 10th, but not announced publicly until that press conference 12 days later, on Wednesday, July 22nd, resolved almost nothing. That press conference itself is worth a specific note, because it happened not in Mississippi but in Chicago, where Crump appeared alongside Nolan's parents to present the findings on a larger national stage rather than back home in Jackson County. Christine Wansley spoke there too, distilling everything this family has been asking for 3 weeks into a single sentence. The only question that we have is what happened to our son. Crump himself put the pathologist's core finding into plainer language than the report's own clinical phrasing. This pathologist cannot rule out if any intervening non-accidental factors contributed to or caused the death of Nolan Wells. The exam itself was privately funded, reportedly by former NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick, who has not spoken publicly about his own involvement, and Nolan's body was flown out of Mississippi entirely to Washington, D.C., specifically so the exam could be performed by an examiner with no institutional ties to Mississippi law enforcement at all. That detail, A body flown across state lines to keep the exam as free of local entanglement as possible is a genuinely significant fact worth naming plainly, because it's also produced its own small media dispute over terminology. At least one conservative outlet has argued that calling this the independent autopsy is misleading, on the reasoning that a privately commissioned exam paid for by a family's own supporters is not neutral in the way the word usually implies, and that the state medical examiner's office, not Dr. Mitchell's exam, is the actually disinterested party in this case. That's a fair semantic point about a word choice, not a challenge to Dr. Mitchell's findings or credentials themselves, and it's worth holding both things at once. Independent here means independent of the state's own investigation, funded by outside supporters rather than the government conducting the underlying criminal inquiry, not independent in the sense of having no connection whatsoever to either side. Whichever word you prefer for it, the findings themselves don't change. Undetermined, undetermined, and a specific list of gaps in what the body could still tell anyone. The cause of death, undetermined. The manner of death, undetermined. The independent pathologist found no lacerations, no fractures, no deep tissue injuries anywhere on the body, which on its face reads like it should ease the darkest suspicions. But decomposition after 2 days in warm Gulf water was severe enough that the pathologist could not determine whether bruising had been present on the skin at all, a limitation, not a clearance. And there was one specific finding that has driven almost all of the renewed attention since: a focal area of red discoloration in the soft tissue at the back of the skull, roughly 12 by 8 inches across the lower part of the head, a finding the pathologist has explicitly called inconclusive rather than either confirming or ruling out trauma. Layered on top of that is a detail that sounds almost bureaucratic until you sit with what it actually means. The trachea, the laryngeal cartilage, the thyroid horn, and the hyoid bone, the small horseshoe-shaped bone in the neck that forensic pathologists rely on heavily to identify strangulation, were never received with the body for the independent exam. Without them, the pathologist has said plainly, he cannot rule out a neck injury as a contributing factor or cause of death. Read all 3 of those findings together, and you get the actual, honest state of the physical evidence in this case, not the version either side of this argument wants it to be. No broken bones, no clear-cut single wound, decomposition too advanced to read the skin, one unexplained area of discoloration nobody can currently explain, and a missing piece of anatomy that closes off the one test that might have settled the strangulation question either way. Undetermined is not a verdict that clears anyone. It is also not a verdict that convicts anyone. It is, as of everything reported to date, simply the truth of what the evidence currently allows anyone to say, and anyone online telling you with total certainty that the autopsy proves one version of the story over another has already told you more than the pathologist himself was willing to. Something else deserves attention here. How differently this exact set of facts has been described depending entirely on which kind of outlet you happen to be watching, because the underlying autopsy findings haven't changed at all across any of that coverage. Only the framing has. Wire services and network affiliates have, for the most part, led with the word undetermined itself and specified the limitations plainly: the decomposition, the missing hyoid, the lack of fractures. Coverage more sympathetic to the family's position has tended to foreground the cannot rule out foul play language and the unexplained discoloration first, sometimes without giving equal weight to the absence of any fractures or lacerations in the same paragraph. Coverage more sympathetic to the friend group's position has tended to do the reverse, leading with no broken bones, no deep tissue injuries, and treating the missing hyoid bone as a minor technicality rather than the specific gap a forensic pathologist himself flagged as preventing him from ruling out a neck injury. All 3 versions are built from the same underlying findings. None of them is fabricating anything outright, but selective emphasis, choosing which true fact to put in your first sentence and which true fact to bury 3 paragraphs down, is one of the most common and least discussed ways a completely accurate set of facts ends up producing 3 completely different impressions in 3 different audiences, and it's worth watching for that pattern in every single piece of coverage this case produces from here forward, this video included. That skepticism has come from every ideological direction, too, which is itself worth noticing rather than assuming this case has broken down along a predictable left-right line. HuffPost's opinion desk has argued the official account of what happened simply doesn't add up as told. The Federalist, from an entirely different editorial direction, has argued that independent autopsy label itself misleads the public. Both are making a skepticism argument. Neither is making the same argument, and neither maps cleanly onto believes the friend group versus believes the family, which is exactly the kind of nuance that gets lost the moment a case gets sorted into simple opposing camps rather than read for what each specific claim actually says. Understanding why undetermined shows up as often as it does in cases involving a body recovered from warm coastal water after multiple days matters here, because that context gets lost the moment a specific finding starts circulating as though it were unique to this case. Decomposition in warm Gulf water moves faster than most people assume, and it actively destroys or degrades exactly the kinds of soft tissue evidence, bruising patterns, petechial hemorrhaging, ligature marks, that a pathologist would need to distinguish an accidental drowning from something else entirely. That's not a convenient excuse manufactured for this case specifically. It's a basic, well-documented limitation of forensic pathology in water recoveries generally, which is exactly why the missing hyoid bone matters as much as it does here. The hyoid, along with the surrounding laryngeal cartilage, is one of the few structures that can sometimes survive decomposition well enough to show fracture patterns consistent with manual strangulation or a ligature, which is precisely why its absence from what the independent pathologist received is being treated as such a significant gap rather than a minor paperwork issue. Without it, an entire category of possible findings, the ones that would most directly point toward or away from someone else's hands being involved, simply isn't available to check. That's not proof anything happened to that part of Nolan's body specifically. It's proof that the single test most capable of settling the hardest version of this question was never able to be run at all, and that absence is going to sit at the center of whatever the grand jury eventually hears, whether or not it ever gets resolved. By the time this case reached its 2-week mark, coverage from outlets that had been tracking it daily since July 4th was already describing it in terms of how many questions still loomed rather than how many had been answered, a notable shift in itself, since the earliest days of national coverage had largely treated it as a story racing toward a quick resolution one way or the other. That shift matters because it tells you something about the shape of this case that a single dramatic headline never could. This was never going to be a story that resolved in a week, or 2 weeks, or even the 3 weeks it had been running by the time the independent autopsy results came back undetermined. It has instead settled into the slower, less satisfying rhythm that most genuinely unresolved deaths eventually do, one incremental release of information at a time, each one answering a piece of the puzzle while opening up 2 more questions in its place, which is exactly the rhythm the rest of this video has tried to track rather than skip past. That single word, undetermined, is exactly the kind of finding that gets weaponized in both directions within hours of release, which is why it's worth sitting with for a moment before moving forward, rather than rushing past it into whatever comes next. This case was never going to resolve itself in one press conference, and it hasn't. If the details in that autopsy section are new to you, or if you've mostly seen this case argued in absolutes online, one side insisting it's obviously an accident, the other insisting it's obviously been covered up, this is the point where it's worth staying subscribed for whatever comes out of the grand jury process the family has now been told to expect, because undetermined is very rarely where these cases end up staying forever. The response from law enforcement in the days immediately after Nolan's body was found is its own separate thread in the story, and it's the thread that turned a tragic drowning, which is what Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter's office initially treated this as, into a case that reached a national NAACP platform within 3 weeks. On July 6th, the day Nolan's body was recovered, Sheriff Ledbetter said publicly that investigators did not suspect foul play, telling reporters at the time, "There's no information that we have right now that would lead us to believe that a crime has occurred." His office has since stressed repeatedly that this was never intended as a final word, that investigators were, in their own language, working diligently to determine exactly what occurred, and it's worth being precise about what that early statement actually was. A preliminary assessment based on what was known in the first 24 hours, not a closed case file. But precision doesn't always travel as far as a soundbite does, and no foul play suspected, said a single day after body is pulled out of the water, landed for a lot of people, including Nolan's own family, as though the door had already been shut before anyone had even finished looking behind it. That frustration is exactly what eventually pulled Ben Crump and the NAACP into this case, culminating in a Friday press conference alongside Reverend Al Sharpton where Crump told reporters, "There are so many inconsistencies going on," describing weeks of staying up with the family, talking to friends, and talking to people who were actually on Horn Island that day, and separately raising, for the first time publicly, the possibility that messages had been deleted from Nolan's phone. NAACP President Derek Johnson went further at a separate appearance, accusing investigators directly of mishandling the case, saying, "We are accusing them of being derelict in their duties to follow up and to ensure that, regardless of what happened, there was a proper investigation." That is about as serious an accusation as a national civil rights organization can level at a local sheriff's department, and it did not land quietly. It's worth noting, though, that the NAACP was never actually one unified voice on the pace of this investigation, and collapsing it into a single position flattens something genuinely instructive. The Mississippi State Conference NAACP has demanded urgency and absolute transparency, and pressed investigators to release relevant details. The local Jackson County chapter, led by Curly Clark, took a visibly more cautious public position, encouraging the community to wait for the facts and stating explicitly that the chapter would not be calling its own press conference until it judged one necessary, choosing to monitor rather than to escalate. That's a real, meaningful difference in tone between the national leadership and the chapter actually embedded in the community where this happened, and it's worth remembering the next time any single organization gets referred to as though it speaks with one voice. Officials in Nolan's own hometown of Ocean Springs organized a visible, public show of backing for Sheriff Ledbetter in direct response, pushing back on the derelict in their duties, framing and arguing that the accusation ignored the actual manpower and multi-agency search effort mounted from the very first morning. So you now have two institutions, a national civil rights organization and a local community's own elected and appointed officials, staking out opposite positions on the same 6 words a sheriff said on day one, and neither position is baseless. The sheriff's office really has emphasized an ongoing, active investigation since that first statement. The family really has been given, by their own repeated public account, very little in the way of concrete updates in the weeks since. Both of those things are true at once, and the tension between them is the actual story here, not a contradiction that needs to be resolved in favor of one side to make sense. The sheriff's own position did fill in considerably as the weeks passed. Worth noting since the day one soundbite is the version that circulates the most. 10 days after his initial statement, on July 14th, Ledbetter said plainly, "We do not rush," and that Nolan Wells' family deserves a thorough and factual investigation, and that's exactly what they're going to get, disclosing that his department had been coordinating with additional agencies, including the FBI, and that a public call for information had already generated what he called valuable leads. Even if you may think that it might be insignificant, every little bit helps. FBI coordination on a case like this one doesn't automatically mean federal agents suspect a civil rights violation. The Bureau routinely assists local departments with resources like phone forensics and interview support on cases far short of that, but it does mean this was no longer solely a county-level inquiry running on county-level resources by that point. It's worth adding one outside, credentialed voice to that specific question of pace, because it doesn't come from either camp already invested in this case. Charles Ramsey, a former police commissioner in both Philadelphia and Washington, D.C., told CNN there was nothing actually surprising about how this investigation's timeline has unfolded, noting that it's common for law enforcement to take well over a week to gather the evidence and interviews needed to determine a cause of death in a case like this one. That's a genuinely useful data point precisely because Ramsey has no stake in defending Sheriff Ledbetter's office or in validating the family's frustration, and his read suggests the slow pace, however agonizing for a grieving family, isn't necessarily evidence of anything being mishandled on its own. That tension is exactly where Nolan's own parents have chosen to put their public focus, and it's worth hearing in their own framing rather than filtered entirely through advocates speaking on their behalf. Christine and Elmore Wansley have said publicly that the damage from those early, no foul play characterizations was already done by the time any further investigation could catch up to it. that the initial narrative shaped by a same-day statement is not easily walked back once it's already spread. They met privately with Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath in Pascagoula, a meeting both sides afterward described as respectful, a word choice worth noticing on its own, since it signals the two sides weren't simply talking past each other by that point, whatever their disagreements over pace and transparency, and came away from it with an assurance that the case will ultimately be presented to a grand jury once the investigative work is complete. That single fact, that this is headed to a grand jury at all, tells you something the no foul play, case closed framing never fully captured. Whatever the sheriff's early public language suggested, the legal process here was never actually finished, and it still isn't. A grand jury presentation doesn't mean charges are coming, and it doesn't mean they aren't. It means a prosecutor is choosing to let a body of citizens, rather than her own office alone, weigh whatever evidence investigators ultimately assemble, which is itself a meaningfully more open posture than a sheriff's same-day statement suggested this case would ever receive. Precision matters about what a grand jury actually does here because the phrase gets thrown around online as though it automatically means someone is about to be charged, and that's not how the process works in Mississippi or anywhere else. A grand jury doesn't determine guilt. It hears evidence presented by the district attorney's office, without a defense attorney cross-examining anything in the room, and decides only whether there's enough for a true bill, probable cause to move forward with formal charges against a specific person, or a no bill, a finding that the evidence, as presented, doesn't support charges at all. In a case like this one, where the cause and manner of death remain officially undetermined, a prosecutor bringing this to a grand jury doesn't necessarily signal she believes a crime occurred. It can just as easily mean she wants a formal, documented record that the evidence was weighed by more than just her own office before any final decision, charging or not charging anyone, gets made. That distinction matters enormously for how you should read every future headline this case produces. Nolan Wells' case headed to grand jury is not the same sentence as someone is about to be arrested, and treating those two things as interchangeable is exactly the kind of shortcut that's fueled most of the worst misinformation in this case so far. As of this recording, no actual grand jury date has been scheduled at all. The DA's office has said only that a grand jury will be convened once the Sheriff's Department's investigation is fully complete, which means the single next concrete milestone in this entire case doesn't have a date attached to it yet, and won't until investigators themselves decide their own work is finished. It's worth walking through what each realistic outcome of that eventual grand jury would actually mean for the specific open threads this video has laid out, because grand jury as a word carries very different weight depending on which way it breaks. A true bill against a specific person would mean a Mississippi grand jury found probable cause that a crime occurred and that a named individual was responsible, which would be the single strongest, most consequential answer this case could produce, and would very likely resolve the Katie versus Hudson contradiction as a matter of formal evidence rather than competing public claims. A no bill would not mean the same thing as the friend group did nothing wrong or Nolan definitely just drowned. It would mean only that the district attorney's office, working with whatever the sheriff's investigation and both autopsies ultimately produced, could not assemble enough evidence to support formal charges against any specific person, which leaves open the very real possibility that this was a preventable tragedy without ever being a provable crime. And it remains entirely possible the case never reaches a grand jury vote in a way the public hears about clearly at all, quietly closing instead the way a great many undetermined cause deaths eventually do, which would leave every single open question in this video permanently unresolved in the way undetermined so often ends up meaning in practice. Not solved, just no longer being actively worked. The DA's office has also been notably candid about a separate problem compounding all of this, one that has nothing to do with the underlying facts of what happened to Nolan, and everything to do with the environment this case is being investigated inside of. A wave of misinformation, including AI-generated photos and videos, some of it targeting Nolan's parents directly, has made the actual work of separating fact from noise measurably harder for investigators and family alike. That's not a side detail. That's a genuinely new kind of obstacle sitting on top of an already difficult case, and it's part of why official updates have been slower and more cautious than a grieving family or a watching public would like. District Attorney McElrath has addressed this tension directly, in a video statement released July 23rd, acknowledging plainly that there is a lot of information out there and a heck of a lot of misinformation out there, and explaining that Mississippi's own rules of professional conduct, not a personal preference for secrecy, limit what a prosecutor can share about an active investigation. Her office also confirmed something worth stating clearly, since it resolves a distinction this video hasn't made explicit until now. There are two separate autopsies in this case, not one. Dr. Roger Mitchell's exam is the independent, privately funded one, whose preliminary findings have already been made public. The official state autopsy, conducted separately by Mississippi's own medical examiner system, will remain sealed and undisclosed until it can be formally reviewed as part of a grand jury presentation. McElrath framed her office's restraint as a deliberate response to a chaotic information environment rather than as evasiveness, saying directly, "Nolan's family deserves answers and our community deserves answers," but adding that the pressure for answers does not change what the work requires, and that the office's responsibility is to complete this investigation thoroughly and carefully, without compromise. That explanation cuts both ways, the same way almost everything else in this case does. It's a genuinely reasonable posture for a prosecutor managing an active investigation already surrounded by fabricated content to take, protecting details that could compromise a future grand jury presentation or tip off exactly what investigators do and don't yet know. It's also from a family that buried their son 3 weeks ago and still doesn't have a clear public accounting of what happened to him, a frustratingly familiar kind of institutional caution, the same caution that produced a same-day, no foul play statement on July 6th, and then months of comparative silence since. Both of those readings of the same decision are legitimate, and holding them at the same time, rather than picking whichever one flatters the side you already sympathize with, is the only honest way to sit with where this case currently stands. Fabricated images depicting Nolan's parents in situations that never happened, synthetic audio clips circulated as though they were real recordings, doctored screenshots presented as leaked messages. All of it has been layered into an already emotionally supercharged case, and every single piece of it makes the job of an actual investigator or an actual journalist harder, not easier, because now every genuine piece of evidence has to clear a higher bar of scrutiny simply because so much fake material has already poisoned the well around it. Now that a six-figure reward is actively sitting on the table, that misinformation problem is likely to get worse before it gets better, and it's worth understanding why plainly rather than being caught off guard by it. High-profile rewards, in almost every well-documented case where one has been offered, reliably generate a wave of low-quality and outright fabricated tips alongside whatever genuine leads eventually surface, simply because $125,000 is real money, and some fraction of the people who see that number attached to a viral case will manufacture a story to try to claim it. That's not a reason to be cynical about the reward itself, which exists specifically because Reverend Al Sharpton, Tyler Perry, and Terrell Owens recognized that financial incentive can occasionally surface a genuine witness who would otherwise have stayed silent. It is a reason to expect, over the coming weeks, a fresh round of supposed leaks, supposed confessions, and supposed inside information circulating online, most of it worthless, some of it deliberately deceptive, and to hold every single piece of it to exactly the same standard everything in this video has been held to. Does it come from a named source? Has it been checked against anything independently verifiable? And does the person offering it have an obvious financial or personal incentive to shape it a particular way? A reward makes new information more likely to surface. It does not make new information automatically more trustworthy, and treating those two things as the same thing is exactly how a legitimate tip ends up buried under a landslide of noise. It's also worth being precise about where a tip would actually go, because there are two entirely separate systems operating in this case, and conflating them is its own small source of confusion. Mississippi Coast Crime Stoppers, the official, law enforcement-affiliated tip program, has publicly clarified that it offers its own standard reward, up to $2,500, tied specifically to an arrest, and has stated plainly that the much larger Sharpton Perry Owens reward is not affiliated with or sponsored by Crime Stoppers at all. Separately, Ben Crump's own law office runs its own private tip line for this case, where information goes directly to his firm rather than to any law enforcement agency, and callers are told their names won't be published. Both systems can be legitimate at once and anonymous, a rest-tied official channel on one side and a private, advocacy-run channel on the other. But they are not the same thing. They don't answer to the same authority, and anyone confusing "I called Ben Crump's tip line" with "I reported this to the police" is misunderstanding how either system actually works. Which brings us, finally, to the exact question this series left hanging at the very end of the last interview, the one about Nolan's phone, and it deserves a real answer rather than being left as an open cliffhanger, because outside reporting has actually moved on this in the days since. The Wells family has publicly alleged that messages appeared to have been erased from Nolan's phone before it was returned to them, with particular focus on Snapchat activity from the day he disappeared. Ben Crump has said the family intends to bring in a forensic expert to determine whether any of that data can still be recovered, and a retired FBI agent consulted by reporters on the general mechanics of this kind of recovery said investigators may still be able to pull several layers of deleted data from a Snapchat account even after a user or someone else has deleted it, because messaging platforms routinely retain server-side records well beyond what disappears from a single device's screen. Most significantly, attorneys for the family have since agreed to a joint inspection of the recovered phone alongside investigators from the district attorney's office, meaning independent experts working for the Wansleys and investigators working for the state will examine the device together rather than the family relying solely on law enforcement's own account of what it contains, or law enforcement relying solely on the family's. As of this recording, that joint inspection had been agreed to, but no results had been publicly announced, which means the honest answer to the question this series ended on is neither. Yes, something was deliberately deleted to hide something, nor no, nothing unusual happened at all. It's that a formal, mutually agreed process now exists specifically to find out, and until it concludes, the deletion claim sits exactly where the autopsy sits, alleged, taken seriously enough to warrant a real forensic process, and not yet independently confirmed one way or the other. In plain terms, a deleted message isn't automatically the same thing as a hidden message, because that distinction is exactly what a joint phone inspection exists to sort out, and it's the kind of nuance that rarely survives a headline. Modern messaging platforms, Snapchat included, are built around ephemeral content by design, messages and photos that are meant to disappear from a device after being viewed, which means an entirely innocent, routine use of the app can produce a phone that looks, to an untrained eye, like evidence has been scrubbed from it, when in fact nothing unusual happened at all beyond the app functioning exactly as it was built to. At the same time, deletion can also be exactly what it sounds like it might be, a deliberate attempt by someone, possibly Nolan himself in an entirely unrelated context, possibly someone else entirely, to remove specific content before a phone changed hands. Server-side retention is what actually separates those two possibilities from each other in practice. Platforms like Snapchat often retain records, sometimes just metadata about when and to whom a message was sent, sometimes more, on their own servers for periods well beyond what a user can see on their own screen, which is why a retired FBI agent's comment about recovering several layers of data matters so much here. It's also why this kind of forensic question typically can't be resolved by a family's own technical consultant alone, since a private company's servers usually require a subpoena or a formal law enforcement request to access at all, which is presumably a meaningful part of why the family's attorneys agreed to a joint inspection process alongside the district attorney's own investigators rather than pursuing separate, competing conclusions. Two sets of experts examining the same device together, rather than each side producing its own account of what it supposedly contains, is about as close as a case like this gets to a built-in check against either side simply asserting whatever conclusion best serves its own narrative. Reporting has also indicated that Nolan's own phone and house keys ended up at a friend's residence rather than coming back with his own body, and that his family had to track both items down themselves, without what they've described as active cooperation from either law enforcement or the friend group at the time. Whether that reflects the same ordinary post-party scattering of personal items this video has already described, or something that actually required more effort to recover than it should have, is one more version of the same open question everything else in this section keeps circling back to. Whatever that phone eventually shows, or doesn't, It's going to get reported the same way everything else in this case has needed to be handled, carefully, slowly, and with the sourcing spelled out rather than assumed. And that is exactly the kind of update that never survives being compressed into someone else's 15-second clip days after the fact. If that's the version of this story you actually want, tracked all the way through instead of picked up secondhand, once it's already been argued over everywhere else, that's what following this channel is for, and it costs you nothing to make sure you don't miss it. From here, the last major question left standing in this whole case is the one that's followed it since the very first headline, and it's worth giving it the same direct treatment everything else in this video has gotten. That question, the one every single outlet covering this case eventually has to circle back to, is whether any of what happened to Nolan Wells has anything to do with race, and it was put to Warren Hudson directly on camera. His answer, unprompted by anything except the question itself, was that Nolan had been folded into that friend group's lives since freshman year of high school, posted on their social media pages going back years, welcomed on boats, at houses, at parties, without a single instance, in his telling, of visible discomfort on Nolan's part. If Nolan ever felt the most little bit uncomfortable around us, Hudson says, he wouldn't hang out around us. That's a genuinely reasonable point, and it's also, on its own, an incomplete answer to the actual question being asked, because the concern that's driven a national civil rights organization into this case was never really about whether these specific friends personally harbored racial animus toward Nolan as an individual. It's about whether an 18-year-old black teenager going missing and a sheriff's department publicly closing the door on foul play within 24 hours would have been handled with the same speed and the same language if the roles, or the racial makeup of that friend group, had been reversed. That's not a question Hudson's personal friendship with Nolan can answer either way, because it was never a question about him specifically. It's a question about a pattern, and patterns get argued with statistics and institutional history, not with one friendship, however genuine that friendship clearly was. There are, in fact, several distinct things that get bundled together every time this case gets discussed as being about race, because collapsing them into a single yes or no question is part of why the online conversation around it has generated so much more heat than light. There is the narrow question Hudson was actually asked and answered. Did anyone in that specific friend group harbor personal racial animus toward Nolan? There is a second, separate question about whether the sheriff's same-day, no foul play statement would have been phrased identically and released on the same 24-hour timeline had the racial dynamics of the friend group and the missing teenager been reversed, which is a question about institutional pattern and public trust, not about any individual's private feelings. There is a third question, distinct again, about whether national media's own early framing of this case, before Hudson or anyone else in the friend group had spoken publicly at all, treated a still-developing story with the caution that an unresolved death actually warranted, or reached for a familiar and more clickable narrative first. And there's a fourth question, about whether the volume and speed of the backlash this friend group has faced, including the specific threats Hudson says kept some of them from speaking publicly at all, reflects a public conversation that has, at points, moved faster than the facts have been able to keep up with, in exactly the same way the sheriff's early statement is accused of having done. Every one of those four questions is legitimate. None of them has the same answer. And treating "was this about race" as a single question with a single answer is exactly the kind of flattening that has made this case harder to talk about honestly from the very first week it became national news. Honesty also requires acknowledging the format this entire account has arrived through, because how a story gets told shapes how much weight it can fairly carry. Brandon Tatum is not a neutral wire service reporter parachuting into Ocean Springs with no prior audience or point of view. He is a commentator with an established following and an established perspective, and Hudson chose to give this account specifically to him rather than to a traditional outlet, at a moment when, by Hudson's own description, other friends in the group were too afraid of threats and backlash to speak publicly at all. That context matters both ways. It means this account arrived through a sympathetic interviewer, which should make you read every claim in it a little more critically than you would a sworn deposition, and it also means it arrived at all on the record under real names, from people who by their own account had every incentive to simply stay silent and let the story be told entirely by other people. A traditional reporter working this case would likely have pushed harder in the moment on some of the exact discrepancies laid out earlier in this video, the brother versus shepherd gap chief among them, rather than letting Hudson's account stand largely unchallenged. That's a real limitation of this kind of interview, and it's also exactly why this video exists. To take what Hudson actually said, and instead of either amplifying it uncritically or dismissing it outright because of who asked the questions, run it against everything independent reporting has been able to confirm since, and show you plainly where those two things agree, and where they don't. The specific detail about other friends staying silent out of fear deserves to be taken seriously on its own terms rather than treated as a throwaway line, because witness intimidation, in either direction, is exactly the kind of force that quietly distorts which version of events the public ends up hearing loudest, regardless of which version happens to be true. If real threats of violence kept some of the young men and women who were on that island or on those boats from ever giving their own account publicly, that's a genuine loss for anyone trying to actually understand what happened, not just for the friend group's public image. It means the version of this story you've heard, across all 4 parts of the series, has come from the subset of people willing to absorb that risk, which skews naturally toward those most confident in their own account, or most protected from the consequences of speaking, or simply most personally close to Nolan, and therefore most motivated to correct what they saw as a distorted public narrative. It doesn't mean the ones who spoke are lying. It does mean the ones who haven't spoken might be holding details that would meaningfully change the shape of this story, favorably or unfavorably, and their absence from the public record is its own kind of gap, sitting right alongside the unresolved Katie versus Hudson contradiction and the still unresolved brother versus Shepherd discrepancy, as one more piece of this case that simply isn't finished yet. Warren Hudson's own mother, Ashley Cole, made that fear explicit in her own public statement well before her son sat down with Tatum, writing on Facebook that Nolan had made a decision to stay on the island and return separately, echoing the exact account her son would later give on camera, and adding, in her own words, "Given the very heightened emotional state of social media right now, I fear for the safety of my child and my children." That's a mother speaking about a genuine, felt fear for her own children's physical safety in the middle of a national news story, months before anyone in her son's friend group agreed to appear on camera at all. And it's worth remembering the next time this video's own account of threats against the friend group gets read as a convenient excuse rather than a lived reality for the families actually involved. One comparison surrounding this case is heavy enough that it deserves its own direct, careful treatment rather than a passing mention, because it's been made by serious people and pushed back on by serious people, and both sides of that disagreement have a real point. Ben Crump himself has invoked the history of racist violence in Mississippi specifically, telling reporters, in effect, that this is the state where Emmett Till was lynched and Medgar Evers was assassinated, framing Nolan's death as continuous with that history. Critics, including commentators who are not otherwise sympathetic to the friend group at all, have pushed back hard on that specific comparison, and their objection is a fair one on its own terms. Till's murder and Evers' assassination were confirmed, admitted, unambiguous acts of racist violence established beyond any factual dispute, while Nolan Wells' cause and manner of death remain, as of everything this video has laid out, officially undetermined. Invoking Mississippi's history of racial violence is not, by itself, an unreasonable thing for a civil rights attorney representing a grieving Black family to do in a state with that specific history. Treating an unresolved, undetermined death as though it has already been proven to be the same kind of event as a confirmed lynching is a different claim entirely, one the evidence gathered so far does not support either way. Both of those things can be true at once. Mississippi's history is real and relevant context for why a family and a community would default to suspicion rather than trust, and comparing this specific case to Till's before the facts are actually known risks asking the evidence to fit a conclusion rather than the other way around. A second example of unverified material circulating around this case is worth naming plainly, in the same spirit as the pool photo and the "give me my phone" quote already addressed earlier, because it follows the identical pattern, an inflammatory claim with no confirmed source spreading faster than anyone could check it. Some online content creators have claimed that witnesses saw several of the young men cleaning the boat late on the night Nolan disappeared, a detail presented, without attribution to any named person, as evidence of something being scrubbed away. No law enforcement statement, no named witness, and no piece of outside reporting used anywhere in this video has confirmed that claim. That doesn't make it impossible. It makes it exactly the same category of claim as the fabricated Nolan voice quote and the misdated pool photo. Something that spread because it was dramatic, not because anyone could actually source it, and it belongs on the same list of things this video refuses to repeat as fact simply because repeating it would be easy and clicks well. A third example belongs on that same list, and it's arguably the most viral single claim connected to this entire case, so it deserves the same direct treatment as the other two. A quote has circulated widely across social media, attributed to one of the young men in the friend group, supposedly reassuring the others with some version of "Don't worry, guys, my dad is an FBI agent and my mom is a judge," offered as proof the group expected to face no real consequences because of their family's connections to law enforcement and the courts. That quote has no confirmed source anywhere in this video's research. It does not appear in any of the 4 on-camera interviews across the series. It is not attributed to a specific named speaker in the posts spreading it, and no outside news outlet used anywhere in this account has independently verified that anyone said it. What is independently confirmed is something quieter and less dramatic. All 5 of the named friends who left the island that day, Wyatt Pyron, Eli Jax Patalo, Eric Alcantara, Morgan Seymour, and, before he gave this series of interviews, Warren Hudson himself, switched their social media accounts to private in the days after Nolan's death and did not respond to news outlets requesting comment. Silence and privacy settings are not evidence of guilt. People close ranks around grief and legal advice for all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with hiding wrongdoing, and Hudson's own decision to eventually speak on camera, at real personal risk according to his own account, cuts directly against reading that earlier silence as concealment. But the specific quote about an FBI agent and a judge is not confirmed, has never been sourced to a real name, and should be treated exactly like the pool photo and the fabricated phone quote, a piece of unverified material that spread because it fit a story people were already primed to believe, not because anyone actually checked it. By any honest count, this single account has now named more than 24 real people, 5 friends, a mother, a stepfather, a grandfather, a sister, a pathologist, a police commissioner, a crime analyst, a sheriff, a district attorney, 2 NAACP leaders, and more, each attached to a specific claim rather than a vague sources say, and that density is itself the point. A story this contested deserves exactly that level of specificity, not less, every single time it gets told again. There's a version of covering a case like this one that just picks a side, decides the friend group is either fully vindicated or fully suspect, and builds 60 seconds of outrage bait around whichever conclusion gets more views. That's not what 3 weeks of actual reporting on Nolan Wells supports, and it's worth being honest about that rather than manufacturing a cleaner story than the one that actually exists. What's confirmed? A boat genuinely took on water and genuinely called for help, on tape, before Nolan was ever reported missing. A photo used as evidence of pre-trip wrongdoing was taken a week to a month earlier and has been independently flagged as misinformation. A viral quote attributed to Nolan's own voice has never been corroborated by anyone and has been directly disputed, by name, by the friend who says it's actually his voice on that recording. An independent autopsy came back undetermined on both cause and manner of death, with 1 unexplained finding and 1 missing piece of anatomy standing between investigators and a cleaner answer. A rip current theory from a rescuer on scene lines up geographically with where the body was ultimately found, even as the family disputes drowning as a full explanation given Nolan's own swimming ability. A 6-figure reward is now sitting on the table for anyone with real information, funded jointly by Reverend Al Sharpton, Tyler Perry, and Terrell Owens. And a joint forensic inspection of Nolan's phone has been agreed to by both the family's experts and the district attorney's own investigators, specifically to settle the deleted messages question neither side has been able to resolve on its own. A former big city police commissioner with no stake in either side has said the investigation's overall pace isn't actually unusual for a case like this. What's still open? Why? In a crowd numbering in the thousands, not one single outside witness has ever come forward with an account of what happened to Nolan once he separated from his friends, a gap at least one outside crime analyst has called shocking. Whether brother in one friend's account and a named friend's own public admission describe the same 15 minutes or 2 different ones. Whether Nolan told Katie he was staying on the island, as his friends maintain, or told her he was heading back to the boat, as Katie herself has since told investigators, since those two accounts cannot both be the plain truth at once. Whether that focal area of discoloration on the back of Nolan's skull turns out to mean something or nothing at all. Whether the phone inspection turns up recoverable messages, and if it does, what they actually say. Whether Crump's more specific claims that a peer pressure argument over substance use happened on the boat, and that the phone was recovered from a friend's possession rather than simply left on a console, hold up once anyone outside his own office is able to check them. Whether Nolan's grandfather's question about a video of the fight refers to footage that actually exists somewhere, or to a video that was never recorded at all. Why the body surfaced on July 6th rather than a day earlier, a specific timing question Crump has raised publicly that no title or current expert has yet addressed on the record. Whether the Sheriff's Department's own toxicology results, still unreleased, ever confirm or quietly close out Crump's separate claim about a substance-related argument on the boat. And whether the Sheriff's Office, months from now, ends up with a grand jury outcome that matches its first-day statement or contradicts it outright. None of those are questions this video can answer for you, and anyone who tells you they already know how they resolve is guessing, loudly, in whichever direction serves the story they'd already decided to tell before the facts came in. Naming, specifically, what would actually have to happen for any of this to move from undetermined into something closer to certainty is a more useful exercise than simply repeating that questions remain open. If the joint phone inspection recovers deleted Snapchat content from the day Nolan disappeared, showing who he was in contact with in his final hours and what was actually said, that closes one of the largest remaining gaps in the timeline almost immediately. If Katie's statement to investigators is ever made public in full, rather than characterized secondhand through an attorney or a friend, that turns the single most consequential contradiction in this entire case from a dispute about who said what into an actual documented record either side can be held to. If further forensic work, even without the missing hyoid bone, is able to rule any additional injury patterns in or out from what remains of the body, that narrows the range of plausible explanations for the still unexplained discoloration at the back of Nolan's skull. And if the grand jury process runs its course and returns either a true bill or a no bill, that is, whatever the outcome, the closest thing to an official, evidentiary answer this case is ever likely to receive, distinct from any sheriff's same-day statement, any attorney's press conference, or any interview given to any commentator, however well-intentioned. Two more items belong on that same list, smaller than the first four, but no less real. If a title or current expert with specific knowledge of Horn Island's waters ever addresses Ben Crump's question about why the body surfaced on the 6th rather than the 5th, that either backs up the rip current explanation the Cajun Navy has already floated or reopens a genuine, currently unanswered timing gap. And if Nolan's grandfather's question about video of the fight ever gets a real answer, either footage surfacing that nobody has shown publicly, or a clear statement that no such recording exists, that closes off one more thread currently living only in a grieving grandfather's Facebook posts. A seventh belongs here too. If the Sheriff's Department's own toxicology results are ever released, whether folded into the official autopsy or made public on their own, that either substantiates or quietly retires Crump's peer pressure claim without requiring a single additional interview from anyone. None of those 7 things has happened yet. All 7 are plausible outcomes of processes already in motion or questions already asked publicly by named people. That's a meaningfully different place for this case to be than where it stood on July 6th, when a single preliminary statement was, for a while, treated by a large share of the public as though it had already answered every question that mattered. With this many names, this many timestamps, and this many competing claims laid out across the last several thousand words, it's worth pulling the whole thing back into one single, uninterrupted line, start to finish, exactly the way you'd want it laid out if you were hearing it for the first time with nothing else in your head. The morning of July 4th, a boat leaves a private dock at 9:56, another boat launched earlier, and by around 11 that morning both have reached Horn Island, joining a crowd that will grow to somewhere in the thousands by early afternoon, spread across 3 rows of anchored boats stretching for miles. Nolan Wells is aboard a 22-foot Triton owned by a friend named Wyatt Pyron, one of roughly 20 to 30 people split across that boat, and 2 others that made the trip together. The day unfolds the way these days do: drinking, swimming, music, friend groups drifting in and out of each other's company across a crowd too large for any one person to track. Around 3:30 in the afternoon, a physical altercation breaks out on the beach involving a young man Warren Hudson calls his brother and, separately, a young man named Tracyston Shepard says was actually himself, an argument with his girlfriend that a third friend, Javen Williams, described simply as a friend being pulled off the island to cool down. Every account of that fight agrees Nolan wasn't in it. Around 3 o'clock, by Ben Crump's office's own account, Nolan is last confirmed seen in the water with a girl named Katie, the two of them laughing. Sometime after that, the Triton's bilge pump fails, its battery goes under, and the boat begins taking on water fast enough that, at approximately 4 o'clock, its operator radios a distress call. "We're at the west tip of Horn, and our bilge pump stopped working. We're sinking, can you all please come?" In the minutes around that same call, by Hudson's account, Wyatt and others call out to Nolan repeatedly to get on the boat, and Nolan declines, saying he'll ride in with someone else, a version Katie herself has since disputed directly to investigators, telling them Nolan said the opposite, that he was heading back to the boat with his friends. The Triton is towed clear by a second boat, planes off once the plug is reset, stops briefly in Fort Bayou at 5:52, docks at 6:06, and is on a trailer headed to Biloxi by 7:19 that evening, a sequence GPS records confirm almost to the minute. Hours later, at a pool party that night, the friend group realizes no one has heard from Nolan, and at 11:07 p.m., Christine Wells Wansley receives a call from Hudson, the first anyone has reached her about her son. Hudson separately calls the Coast Guard around the same time, and the Coast Guard determines that night that the report does not require its assistance. It is not until 12:26 the following afternoon, July 5th, that the Jackson County Sheriff's Office formally requests Coast Guard support, triggering a multi-agency search across 4 barrier islands. On the morning of July 6th, a park ranger finds a body on the northwestern tip of Horn Island. Aerial photographs taken separately that same morning by United Cajun Navy Vice President Brian Troshers later turn out to have captured it without his knowing at the time, and the body is confirmed to be Nolan Wells. Sheriff John Ledbetter states publicly that day that no foul play is suspected, a statement Warren Hudson's own mother, Ashley Cole, echoes soon after with her own Facebook post backing her son's account and voicing fear for her children's safety amid the backlash. Within days, Nolan's grandfather, Christopher Wells Sr., posts publicly demanding to know how Searched Island produced a body overnight and asking where video of the earlier fight has gone. In the days and weeks that follow, a viral video is misattributed first to Nolan's voice and then publicly reattributed to Tracyston Shepard. A photo from June 27th is misidentified online as evidence from the trip itself. Colin Kaepernick quietly funds a private autopsy performed in Washington, D.C. by Dr. Roger Mitchell. Hundreds gather in protest in Ocean Springs. Ben Crump and the NAACP enter the case, invoking Mississippi's history with Emmett Till and Medgar Evers and Derek Johnson. Accuses investigators of being derelict in their duties. Christine Wells Wansley receives anonymous racist hate mail attacking Sharpton and Crump. Hundreds more gather for a funeral at Centerpoint Church where Sharpton, Tyler Perry, and Terrell Owens jointly fund a reward that grows to $125,000. Dr. Mitchell's findings return undetermined on both cause and manner of death, hampered by decomposition and a missing hyoid bone. Television commentator Nancy Grace publicly declares that somebody's lying about the Katie contradiction. The family meets with District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath and is told the case will go to a grand jury with no date yet set, and attorneys for the family agree to a joint forensic inspection of Nolan's phone to examine allegations that Snapchat messages were deleted from it. That is everything currently on the public record, laid end to end, with nothing skipped and nothing resolved that the record itself hasn't resolved, as of the 24th of July, exactly 3 weeks to the day since Nolan Wells left a private dock at 9:56 in the morning with nothing more unusual planned than a holiday on the water. Transparency about exactly how this account was checked matters here, because, trust me, has never been a good enough standard for a case involving a real family, a real investigation, and a real 18-year-old who can no longer speak for himself. Every named claim in this video that didn't come directly from Warren Hudson's own on-camera interviews was checked against reporting from outlets including CNN, NPR, ABC News, NBC News, CBS News, The Associated Press, TMZ, Rolling Stone, Newsweek, the Mississippi Free Press, WLOX, The Griot, The Washington Post, PBS NewsHour, Atlanta Black Star, Word and Black, Our Weekly, News Nation, and Globe Magazine's ongoing case coverage, alongside public statements and press materials issued directly by Attorney Ben Crump's office, the United Cajun Navy, and the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. Where those outside sources confirmed a detail from Hudson's account, the GPS timeline, the distress call audio, the pool photo's real date, the timing of the mother's phone call, that confirmation is stated plainly rather than left implied. Where a claim exists only inside Hudson's own retelling, with no independent source confirming it either way, that's been flagged the same way, explicitly, rather than smoothed over to make the narrative read more cleanly. And where outside reporting actively complicates or contradicts something in his account, the beach fight chief among them, that tension has been left standing rather than resolved in favor of whichever version made for a more satisfying story. That's the entire discipline this kind of case demands, not because any one video can single-handedly solve what a grand jury, a forensic phone inspection, and an ongoing sheriff's investigation haven't yet resolved, but because a family is still waiting for real answers, and adding one more confidently wrong narrative to the pile, in either direction, doesn't get them any closer to having those answers. None of that discipline requires taking this video's word for any of it, either, and it shouldn't. Every named outlet, every quoted sentence, and every named person in this account can be checked independently against public reporting, which is exactly the point. A video that asks you to simply trust its conclusions is doing the same thing this entire account has spent this long warning you about. A video that hands you the names, the dates, and the outlets so you can go verify it yourself is doing something different, and that difference is the entire reason this kind of careful, slower coverage exists at all. If there's one thing worth taking away from laying all of this out end to end, it's that undetermined is not the same word as nothing happened, and it is also not the same word as something was covered up. It's the word a trained pathologist used because it's the only word the current physical evidence actually supports, and everything's still ahead in this case. The grand jury, the phone inspection, whatever forensic follow-up becomes possible, whatever Katie or Traciston Shepard, or anyone else still holding a piece of that day eventually says on the record, is going to matter more than any single clip that's already gone viral. Remember, too, how this entire case actually started, before any of the words grand jury or independent autopsy or joint phone inspection had entered the conversation at all. It started as an ordinary 4th of July, the kind Nolan Wells had spent nearly every year of his life the same way, on a boat, with the same friends he'd known since elementary school, heading out to the same island his whole hometown treats as the unofficial center of the holiday. Nothing about that morning, the McDonald's run, the boat hitched to a truck, 20 or 30 kids converging at a friend's grandparents' house, marked it as the kind of day that ends with a mother identifying her son's body 2 days later. That ordinariness is not a detail to rush past. It's the reason this case has generated the exact kind of grief and suspicion it has, because when something this catastrophic emerges out of something this unremarkable, the human instinct is to search backward for the exact moment it must have gone wrong, and to assume that moment has to be dramatic, has to involve a villain, has to be the kind of thing that makes sense as a story. Sometimes it is. The independent autopsy leaves that door open, deliberately, honestly, because the evidence hasn't closed it. But sometimes the true, full accounting of a tragedy really is closer to what a rip current and a steep drop-off and a chest-deep crowd of strangers and murky, rain-churned water can do to one 18-year-old who made an ordinary, common, thousands of times before decision to stay a little longer and catch a ride home with someone else. Both of those possibilities have to stay on the table until the evidence, not the algorithm, not the loudest voice, not the most confident commentator, closes one of them off for good. That's also why the Katie contradiction sitting at the center of this case matters more than almost anything else covered here, and why it deserves to be the thing you remember longest rather than any single viral clip. Not because it proves anyone did anything wrong, it doesn't on its own prove that at all. It matters because it's the one piece of this entire story where two named, specific, identifiable people are describing two different, mutually exclusive versions of Nolan Wells's own last known intention, and nothing else in this case. Not the autopsy, not the phone, not the grandfather's questions, not the reward, not a single comparison to Mississippi's darker history actually resolves until someone figures out which version of that final conversation is true. Comparisons to Emmett Till reach for history, because history is the only thing that feels solid enough to stand on when the present keeps producing more contradictions than answers. But Nolan Wells doesn't need his death compared to anyone else's to matter on its own terms, and forcing that comparison before the facts are settled risks doing exactly what the earliest no foul play statement did in the other direction, reaching a conclusion the evidence hasn't actually earned yet. Online sleuths, and at least one black press outlet, have also drawn comparisons to other cases entirely, including that of Tamla Horsford, a Georgia mother whose own death at a house party years earlier sparked similar questions about a group of white attendees, and an official ruling many found unsatisfying, and that of Ronald Settles, a 21-year-old college football player found dead in a California jail cell in 1981 after a traffic stop, a case that ended in a coroner's jury finding his death a homicide despite the arresting department's own account. That second comparison is worth flagging as meaningfully different in kind from the first two. Settles died in police custody, a fundamentally different situation than a group of civilian friends on a boat, and collapsing the two into a single pattern risks obscuring exactly the kind of specific facts this video has spent this long trying to keep straight. This video isn't the place to relitigate any of those separate cases, each of which has its own distinct facts, its own separate investigation, and its own history this account hasn't researched deeply enough to characterize responsibly. What's worth noting is only the pattern itself. When official explanations arrive quickly and land as incomplete, people reach for the nearest comparable story to make sense of the gap, and that instinct is human and understandable even when the two cases being compared don't actually share the same evidence. Count up everyone who has now put their name to some piece of the story, and the sheer number of it says something about how far a single day at Horn Island has traveled. 5 friends whose names are now permanently attached to the sheriff's own account of who left the island. A mother, a stepfather, a grandfather, and a sister, each speaking in their own voice rather than through a single unified family statement. A pathologist with national credentials, a former police commissioner, a crime analyst, a television prosecutor, and a search and rescue volunteer, none of them personally connected to Nolan before his death. All of them now on the record about some piece of what happened to him. 2 civil rights institutions disagreeing with each other about tone. 3 prominent athletes and entertainers putting real money behind a family they'd never met. And still, after all of that, after every one of those names and every one of those statements, the single most basic fact this case turns on, what Nolan Wells actually intended to do in the last conversation anyone had with him, remains genuinely, honestly unsettled. That's not a failure of reporting. It's an honest reflection of how thin the evidence actually is at the center of an enormous amount of noise, and it's exactly why every one of those names deserve to be named plainly here rather than collapsed into sources say, or reports indicate, phrases that let vague authorities stand in for the harder work of saying exactly who claimed what and how much weight that claim can actually carry. Watching this case responsibly from here forward means doing exactly that same work yourself, every single time a new detail surfaces, rather than outsourcing it to whichever commentator already agrees with what you were inclined to believe before any of this started. Ask who is actually saying the thing being repeated. Ask whether that person was there, was told secondhand, or is characterizing someone else's account of what a third person supposedly said. Ask whether the claim has shown up anywhere outside the one place you first saw it. And ask every time whether the person delivering it has anything to gain, a platform, reward, an advocacy relationship, an audience that rewards a particular conclusion from you believing it. None of those questions require distrusting everyone in this story. Warren Hudson answered hard questions under his own name at real personal risk. Christine Wells Wansley has spoken through grief with more composure than most people could manage. Sheriff Ledbetter's office has kept working a case that hasn't gotten easier with time. Asking those questions simply means giving every one of them the same standard, rather than a different one depending on which side of this you already wanted to be right. That's exactly the kind of update that doesn't land all at once. It lands in pieces over weeks, sometimes months, and if you want those pieces followed all the way through instead of picking up wherever the algorithm happens to hand it to you next, that's the actual reason to stay subscribed here rather than anywhere louder and less careful. Nolan Wells was, by every account, from every single person who has spoken about him on the record, his best friend, his own mother, strangers in his own hometown who never met him, someone who made rooms brighter just by being in them, someone who could make a person feel like they belonged with nothing more than a few words, someone who, by his own coach's account, celebrated his teammates' wins as hard as he would have celebrated his own. Whatever the physical evidence eventually settles on, whatever that phone turns out to hold, whatever a grand jury someday decides or declines to decide, that part of the story was never actually in dispute, and it shouldn't get lost underneath everything that still is. Nolan Wells would have turned 19 years old within the month, and that single fact is worth sitting with for exactly one more second before this ends, because every argument laid out across this entire account, the timelines, the discrepancies, the autopsies, the reward, the grand jury, all of it, exists only because a teenager who still had a birthday coming never got to see it.